Hello, my dear friends. They didn't just sleep in filth, they slept with it. In Victorian bedrooms, every breath, every blanket, and every body carried its own quiet decay. The air was thick with sweat and perfume, beds shared with strangers, vermin and ghosts of the dead. Curtains trapped sickness, straw mattresses whispered with life beneath the skin, and perfume could not hide what time refused to clean. Tonight, you'll sink into that same darkness, where sleep was never peaceful and the bed itself was alive. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now we'll dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If one were to enter a Victorian bedroom at the end of a long day, the first thing that would strike them would be the air itself. It carried a heavy stillness, the scent of coal smoke mixed with sweat and fabric, and a faint sourness that lingered near the sheets. Bathing before bed was a practice few dared to keep. The night was believed to bring sickness, and water was seen as the carrier of cold. Many thought that washing the body after sunset would invite fever or weakness, especially in women whose strength was already doubted. Instead, a damp cloth would be passed across the face and hands, a small gesture meant to imitate cleanliness. After that, people simply climbed into bed, their skin still covered in the day's dust and their hair still smelling of smoke and kitchen heat. The fear of nighttime water ran deep. Doctors and housekeepers alike spoke of the dangerous chill that could strike when pores opened and air turned cool. A woman who bathed too late might, they said, wake with trembling hands or a cough that lasted through the winter. So, families grew used to sleeping in their own sweat. Water was reserved for mornings, or not at all. For the working poor, even that was a luxury. Buckets of water had to be carried from pumps or public wells, often already murky by evening. Heating it required coal, which cost more than most could spare. A quick wipe with a damp rag seemed more reasonable, even if it left the body no cleaner than before. Beds became quiet witnesses to this habit. Dust from the streets clung to bare feet, soot settled on skin, and traces of cooking oil from supper still marked the fingers. All of it was carried beneath the covers, pressed into fabric through the night. It is almost darkly funny to imagine people so afraid of catching a chill from clean water, yet so comfortable sleeping in the layers of dirt. The belief in invisible illness seemed stronger than any sense of physical filth. The body could ache, but fear kept them still, and so, night after night, they lay in sheets that remembered every scent of the day. The linen absorbed sweat until it darkened, and the scent of humanity filled every room. For those who could afford perfume, a few drops on the pillow or collar were thought to help, but perfume only hid what remained beneath. It mingled with the odour of oil, smoke, and labour, creating something sharp and sour that clung to the air. People accepted this as the natural smell of a life. Even children went to bed unwashed, their small hands still sticky from food, their hair clumped from the day's play. In homes where the same cloth was used for faces, dishes, and floors, the concept of cleanliness was less about removing dirt and more about maintaining order. At night, the faint warmth of bodies filled the room. Those who slept in shared beds would sometimes turn their faces away to avoid another's breath, yet they were all breathing the same stale air. If one were to compare it to today, it would be like coming home from a polluted city, skipping a shower, and curling up under a blanket already soaked with sweat from the week before. The difference is that Victorians believed such restraint was moral. Cleanliness at the wrong time was vanity, and vanity was sin. The act of going to bed dirty was not seen as laziness but prudence. The poor suffered the most, of course. Their homes stood closest to the factories, their wells shared with animals. The water they fetched often carried the taste of iron or rot. For them, bathing before bed would have been both costly and risky. Fires burned out early to save coal, and cold water after dark could send a shock through an exhausted body. Better to sleep dirty than wake fevered. The belief held firm even as cities grew and new ideas about hygiene spread. Old fears simply changed shape. Doctors argued that bathing too often weakened the blood, especially for women. A pale complexion and a faint scent of labour were seen as marks of modesty, not neglect. Inside the homes of the middle class, basins stood unused through the night. Towels were folded neatly, but their purpose was symbolic. The body was meant to rest, not to be disturbed. Even servants, who might wash in secret after cleaning their master's rooms, did so quietly and quickly, fearful of being accused of waste or vanity. There is something quietly tragic in the thought that fear and superstition could make dirt seem safer than water. To live surrounded by filth and yet believe oneself pure was perhaps the most Victorian contradiction of all. The hours before sleep were heavy and still. Candles flickered low, and the day's grime settled into every fold of fabric. As people pulled blankets over themselves, they carried the scent of labour, smoke, and the street. To them, it was simply comfort. Their bodies adjusted, their skin learned to bear the weight of unwashed days. The idea of scrubbing away the dirt felt unnecessary when the world itself was dirty. By morning, the sweat had dried, leaving faint outlines on the sheets. The same cloths would be used again and again, shaken out in the cold light, then laid flat as if they were new. The routine was efficient, respectable, and quietly revolting. Yet it worked, because everyone did it, and no one spoke of the discomfort. To question it would be to question custom itself, something far more dangerous than disease. In a society that prized obedience over reason, even washing could be rebellion. Those who insisted on cleanliness risked being mocked for excess. A woman who demanded warm water at night was indulgent. A man who bathed daily was thought delicate. Dirt, in its strange way, became a sign of virtue. The body bore it silently, as it bore hunger, fatigue, and fear. People drifted to sleep convinced that stillness protected them. The damp air of their rooms carried no judgment. Outside, chimneys smoked, and the same air crept back through windows and doors. It was a cycle that never broke. Night after night, the fear of water shaped the comfort of the unwashed, and the comfort of the unwashed shaped an empire that mistook grime for good sense. Each night, the Victorians rested in the same dirt they feared to wash away. The warmth of habit replaced the sting of water, and superstition passed quietly from parent to child. One can almost feel the stillness of those rooms, the breath of sleepers trapped in stale air, believing it was safety. But as the body slept, the dirt began to spread beyond the skin, seeping into sheets and into the air itself, giving rise to something that even their strongest fears could not keep out. The beds of Victorian homes rarely smelled of soap. Laundry was not a weekly routine but an ordeal that required strength, space, and fuel most households did not have. Washing a sheet meant carrying water by hand, boiling it over coal, scrubbing fabric until arms ached, and finding enough air to dry it in soot-filled streets. Because of this, most families postponed the task until the dirt became unbearable. Some washed their bedding once a season, others waited an entire year. The result was that most nights were spent lying beneath layers of fabric that remembered everything the body had done. Each fold of the sheet trapped fragments of life skin flakes, fallen hairs, traces of sweat and oil. On cold nights, this residue stiffened and clung like an invisible second skin. The colour of the cloth was rarely white for long. It shifted from cream to yellow, then to a brownish shade that people politely called aged. Still, it was considered respectable so long as no stains were too obvious. There was a strange pride in surviving filth, as if endurance itself were proof of morality. A clean bed was pleasant but unnecessary. What mattered was thrift, and thrift meant leaving things as they were. Perfume became the substitute for soap. Bottles of rosewater or lavender were sprinkled on pillowcases, their fragrance mixing with the sour odour beneath. The combination was heavy, almost sweet enough to sting the nose. Housewives boasted of their scented linens, unaware that the scent came from rot and not from flowers. When guests visited, the smell was described as homely, a word that meant comfort rather than hygiene. Cleanliness was a luxury for the wealthy, and for everyone else. The illusion of it was enough. Servants suffered most from this system. They were the ones who lifted soaked bedding, carried buckets up narrow stairs, and scrubbed until their fingers split. Many households owned only one set of sheets, forcing the same fabric to return to the bed while still damp. On winter days, moisture froze into stiff corners that melted under the sleeper's warmth. If one compared it to modern life, it would be like using the same unwashed towel for months, then misting it with perfume before pressing it against your face every night. The idea sounds unbearable now, but in Victorian homes, it was perfectly normal. Beds carried not only dirt but memories of sickness. When someone fell ill, they sweated through fevers, coughed into pillows, and bled into the sheets. Yet when the illness passed, the linen stayed. To wash them too soon was thought wasteful, even unlucky. There were stories of families who laundered too quickly after a death and were struck by misfortune, so they learned not to disturb the bed's spirit. They let stains fade on their own, though many never did. The sheets that held one generation of bodies might cradle the next. Among the working poor, washing was almost impossible. Shared houses had no space to hang laundry, and water from public pumps carried grime from the streets. Soiled linens were beaten against walls or soaked in rain barrels. In crowded neighbourhoods, one could see sheets hanging grey and dripping from every window, flapping like tired flags. When rain did not come, people simply aired their bedding in the wind, hoping sunlight would do what soap could not. It is difficult not to feel a kind of quiet sadness at how normal it all was. The effort of staying alive left little strength for cleanliness, and exhaustion made dirt seem harmless. For middle-class families, appearances were more important than purity. They could afford to change the pillowcases, and that was enough to impress visitors. The inner layers, blankets, mattresses, and the thick feather pillows remained untouched. A maid might shake them each morning, beating dust into the air before smoothing the surface again. The gesture created a look of order that Victorians confused with cleanliness. Beds gleamed by daylight, but under the surface, they were alive with things no one wanted to name. It was common for insects to hide in the folds. Fleas from pets or lice from the scalp found perfect shelter in the seams of fabric. When people complained of itching at night, they blamed the weather or their nerves. The truth was too intimate to face. To admit that one's own bed was crawling meant admitting to failure. So they scratched in silence and slept again. The rituals of tidying were easier than the reality of washing, and denial became a nightly comfort. Even the wealthiest homes were not immune. Heavy velvet blankets and embroidered quilts were rarely cleaned because they were too delicate to wash. Servants brushed them instead, lifting only the dust that showed. Perfumed sachets were placed between folds to refresh the scent. The air in these bedrooms was thick with the sweetness of decay. To visitors, it smelled luxurious. To the sleepers, it was simply the smell of night. In the absence of modern knowledge, people mistook endurance for health. If the bed felt warm and soft, it was assumed to be clean. The idea that sickness could spread through fabric was not yet common sense. Only later, when germ theory arrived, did reformers begin to preach the importance of laundering sheets. By then, millions had already lived and died in contact with their own residue, wrapped in the comfort of decay. Victorian bedding held not just sleep, but the entire record of its owner's life. The same sheets that softened under a child's dreams hardened under an old man's sweat. It is strange to imagine that such intimacy with dirt was once considered respectable, even virtuous. The beds of Victorian homes were more than places of rest. They were quiet archives of dust, sweat, and forgotten days. Each night's sleep pressed another layer of life into the fabric, deepening the unseen decay beneath the surface. Yet beneath those heavy covers, something else was stirring, hidden within the straw and rags that no one had ever thought to replace. The beds of Victorian homes were not soft havens of rest, but rough structures stuffed with decay. Beneath the fine quilts and embroidered covers lay sacks filled with straw, wool, or rags that had not been touched since the day they were first stuffed. These makeshift mattresses were considered practical, reliable, and long-lasting. A new couple might receive a straw bed on their wedding day and sleep on that same one until death. To replace it was not a matter of comfort, but of luxury, one that few could justify. The straw inside was expected to last as long as the marriage itself, absorbing every sweat, every sickness, and every silent night that passed over it. Over time, the straw grew soft, then damp, then dark. Each season added new smells, the sour trace of human warmth mixing with the faint rot of plants long dead. When a person rolled over, the straw shifted beneath them with a muffled crackle. At first, that sound was comforting, a sign of rest. But as the years went on, the noise grew faint, replaced by the rustle of insects. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs found perfect homes in the soft decay. They bred in the dark seams, feeding on the heat and blood of their sleeping hosts. No matter how thick the blankets, nothing could hide the feeling of something moving under the skin. It almost seems absurd that a society obsessed with decorum could sleep every night on beds alive with vermin. The straw bed became an ecosystem of its own. Dust fell through cracks in the ceiling and mixed with the broken husks of the past harvest. Bits of hay stuck to the sleeper's skin and hair, leaving fine scratches that they mistook for rashes. During winter, the dampness never truly left the bed. The moisture condensed in the lower layers, and when people woke, their sheets were cool and clammy. The smell of mould was constant, especially in houses where windows were never opened. Still, people stayed loyal to their old straw mattresses, convinced that age meant comfort. To them, the softness that came from decay felt like luxury. Wool-stuffed beds were no better. They held heat in summer and trapped moisture in winter. The lanolin from unwashed wool turned rancid over time, giving off a faintly sour odour that clung to clothes and hair. Housewives sometimes sprinkled the mattresses with crushed herbs or dried flowers, believing it would keep away pests. The smell was pleasant for a day, maybe two, before it sank beneath the stronger scent of damp straw and unwashed bodies. If we compare it to modern life, it would be like sleeping for years on a pile of used clothing soaked in sweat, sprayed with perfume, and left to ferment in a closed room. The image feels unbearable now, yet in the Victorian home, it was simply routine. To replace the filling was a task few attempted. Straw was cheap, but the work was immense. It had to be carried, dried, and fluffed before being packed tightly again. That meant moving the heavy bed frame, emptying the old filling, and spreading it out under the sun. Most homes did not have the space or time for such labour, and then there was the superstition. People whispered that disturbing the straw might bring misfortune. It was said that new straw carried the chill of the fields, that it needed to settle under a body's warmth before it became safe to sleep upon. Old straw, though full of insects, was acclimated. It was considered personal, even intimate, tied to the sleeper's own body. To change it was to erase a part of oneself. For those too poor to afford straw at all, the situation was worse. They stuffed their mattresses with whatever could be found, old cloth, rags, or even dried leaves. In damp houses, the filling decomposed quickly, creating pockets of black dust that left stains when pressed. Some added sawdust to keep the shape, which only worsened the itch and made every shift in bed sound like the scuttling of mice. Yet the bed remained a prized possession. In homes where furniture was scarce, it was the one thing that belonged entirely to the family. Even if it smelled of rot, even if it crawled with life, It was theirs. Servants often had the oldest straw. When their masters upgraded to slightly newer bedding, the discarded sacks were handed down. These were flattened, patched, and too small to fill the bed frames of the servants' quarters. Lying on them meant sleeping directly against the wood, feeling every slat and nail through the thin layer of hay. In winter, frost gathered along the edges, and the straw hardened into stiff clumps. Yet no one complained. Complaints did not feed you, and they certainly did not earn you better straw. In wealthier homes, appearances mattered more than the comfort of those who lived there. Bed frames might be carved from mahogany and draped in embroidered curtains, but inside, the mattress was still filled with straw. The covers were luxurious disguises. Guests might admire the shining wood, the clean sheets, and the gentle scent of lavender. But beneath all that elegance lay the same rotting core. It was as if cleanliness could be faked through appearances alone. It is difficult not to feel a certain discomfort imagining that behind every polished bedpost was a slow decay no one dared to touch. Doctors and reformers occasionally warned of the dangers. They spoke of fevers caused by unclean bedding and recommended replacing the straw every year. But their advice was ignored by most. The poor could not afford to waste good straw, and the rich did not like being told their habits were unhealthy. Even when bed bugs were discovered, people preferred to sprinkle the mattress with vinegar or camphor rather than remove the filling. The infestation always returned, but denial was easier than the truth. Night after night, families climbed into these beds as though nothing were wrong. They wrapped themselves in blankets that trapped the warmth of decay, listening to the faint scratching beneath. Children grew up believing that itching in the dark was simply part of the life. Husbands and wives grew old together in the same straw, and when one died, the survivor often continued to sleep there. The body left, but the scent remained, and no one thought to replace it. The bed became more than furniture. It was a record of living. Every illness, every tear, every breath that settled in the night became part of its filling. The straw compressed, hardened, and darkened until it was almost black. Some beds were kept so long that when they were finally opened, the straw had turned to dust. The air inside was thick with a smell that even time could not erase. And still, people believed they had slept well. By the end of the century, cleaner materials began to appear. Springs and cotton fillings offered an alternative, but they were expensive and foreign to tradition. Many households held onto their old straw beds until they crumbled. To them, comfort was habit, and habit was safety. In a world full of uncertainty, even filth could feel familiar. The Victorian bed was not a place of rest, but a monument to endurance. It held the weight of bodies, fears, and years of neglect until it became indistinguishable from the people who slept upon it. Something is haunting in how comfort and decay could coexist so quietly, sharing the same shape beneath the sheets. And as the straw slowly turned to dust, people began to sense that the filth beneath them was no longer silent, that something in those beds had begun to crawl its way out into the room. The straw-filled beds of Victorian homes were silent witnesses to years of neglect and slow decay. Each night's warmth only deepened the rot beneath the sleepers' bodies. When the first signs of life began to stir under the sheets, it marked the beginning of a far more disturbing intimacy with what shared their beds. In the crowded towns of Victorian England, a bed was not something one owned, it was something one borrowed. The poorest workers, travellers, and drifters paid by the night or even by the hour, trading a few coins for a patch of warmth that had already been used by countless others. These were known as common lodging houses, their rooms packed tight with iron beds, thin sheets, and the thick odour of unwashed bodies. Sleep came in shifts. As one person rose, another lay down, the warmth of the last sleeper still clinging to the fabric. There was no pause, no cleaning, no moment for the mattress to rest. The bed, like the street outside, was always in motion. In these places, privacy did not exist. The narrow rooms echoed with the sounds of coughing, snoring, and restless bodies turning against one another. For the price of a loaf of bread, a man could claim a spot on a straw mattress already damp with another's sweat. Those who could not afford that much slept sitting up in penny sits, rows of benches where people leaned forward on ropes strung across the room. The lucky ones had beds, the unlucky ones had splinters and cold air, but all of them shared the same air thick with breath and disease. It is bitterly funny to think that in a society so proud of its manners, strangers could lie down side by side in filth without a word. The bedding was rarely changed. When the sheets turned dark or began to smell, an attendant would simply flip them over and smooth the surface with his hands. Sometimes a splash of water or a handful of sawdust was thrown over the stains to dull the odour. It did nothing but spread the dirt more evenly. Beneath the thin linen lay mattresses filled with rags or straw, alive with bedbugs and fleas. They crept over the bodies of sleepers, leaving bites that burned for days. Yet the customers returned night after night. It was better than the street. For those who came in from the cold, the first touch of the bed's lingering warmth felt almost human. They ignored the dampness, the smell, the faint scratching beneath. Exhaustion drowned out disgust. Men who worked 18 hours in factories or on docks cared little who had slept before them. They lay down, pulled the blanket to their chins, and closed their eyes. If one compared it to modern life, it would be like renting a hotel room where the sheets are never washed and the previous guest has only just stepped out of bed. The difference is that for the Victorian poor, there was no other choice. The beds held more than warmth. They held stories of sickness, hunger, and quiet death. When someone died in a lodging house, the body was carried out and the bed reused before the night was over. No one spoke of infection or contagion. The living could not afford fear. They shared everything: space, breath, and whatever invisible poisons passed from one body to another. Some awoke to find their neighbours gone cold beside them. Others never woke at all. The air inside these houses was heavy and sour. Windows were sealed against the night wind, and candles smoked on the walls. The scent of sweat mixed with coal dust and the damp of unwashed bedding. The floors creaked beneath the weight of footsteps and dripping boots. At dawn, the room came alive with the noise of movement, coins clinking, beds creaking, doors slamming. By midday, new bodies had taken their place, and the rhythm began again. There was no beginning or end to it, only rotation. For women and children, the experience was harsher. Families too poor to rent separate rooms slept in the same quarters as strangers. Mothers curled around their children, trying to form a barrier between them and the unknown figures on the other side. In the dark, hands sometimes wandered. Many learned to sleep lightly, half awake, half aware. Still, the need for warmth outweighed the fear. The thin blankets covered shame as well as skin. These beds were not just breeding grounds for insects, but for disease. Typhus, tuberculosis, and influenza thrived in the close air. Doctors described these houses as fever nests, yet few efforts were made to close them. The poor were too many, and the alternatives too few. Authorities called it charity that such beds existed at all. To those who used them, it was survival disguised as sleep. Every object in these rooms told a story of repetition. The mattresses sagged under years of weight, the frames rusted from constant damp. The same thin pillow might cradle a dozen heads in a single week. The scratches on the walls, the stains on the floor, and the smell of bodies past clung to every surface. For the keepers of these houses, there was profit in endurance. The more a bed was used, the more money it earned. Cleaning it meant losing time, and time was money. There was a strange intimacy in such shared spaces. People who would never speak on the street slept inches apart, breathing each other's air. In the darkness, all differences dissolved. Worker and thief, woman and child, all wrapped in the same stale warmth. In the silence of the night, Their breathing merged into a single weary rhythm. For a few hours, it almost resembled peace. But when morning came, they rose again, leaving behind a hollow warmth for the next stranger to claim. Victorian lodging houses turned sleep into a transaction, traded warmth between bodies as if it were currency. The idea of comfort faded before the simple need to endure. There is something quietly horrifying about rest that carries another's dirt, another's scent, another's sorrow. And when those borrowed beds began to crawl with more than insects, the thin line between rest and rot started to blur, revealing what truly shared the night with them. In the rented beds of Victorian towns, sleep itself became communal, shared among strangers and unseen creatures alike. The boundary between safety and sickness was as thin as the sheet that divided one sleeper from the next. But deeper within those homes, something even smaller and hungrier waited for its turn to feed. In the crowded towns of Victorian England, a bed was not something one owned, it was something one borrowed. The poorest workers, travellers, and drifters paid by the night or even by the hour, trading a few coins for a patch of warmth that had already been used by countless others. These were known as common lodging houses, their rooms packed tight with iron beds, thin sheets, and the thick odour of unwashed bodies. Sleep came in shifts. As one person rose, another lay down, the warmth of the last sleeper still clinging to the fabric. There was no pause, no cleaning, no moment for the mattress to rest. The bed, like the street outside, was always in motion. In these places, privacy did not exist. The narrow rooms echoed with the sounds of coughing, snoring, and restless bodies turning against one another. For the price of a loaf of bread, a man could claim a spot on a straw mattress already damp with another's sweat. Those who could not afford that much slept sitting up in penny sits, rows of benches where people leaned forward on ropes strung across the room. The lucky ones had beds, the unlucky ones had splinters and cold air, but all of them shared the same air thick with breath and disease. It is bitterly funny to think that in a society so proud of its manners, strangers could lie down side by side in filth without a word. The bedding was rarely changed. When the sheets turned dark or began to smell, an attendant would simply flip them over and smooth the surface with his hands. Sometimes a splash of water or a handful of sawdust was thrown over the stains to dull the odour. It did nothing but spread the dirt more evenly. Beneath the thin linen lay mattresses filled with rags or straw, alive with bedbugs and fleas. They crept over the bodies of sleepers, leaving bites that burned for days. Yet the customers returned night after night. It was better than the street. For those who came in from the cold, the first touch of the bed's lingering warmth felt almost human. They ignored the dampness, the smell, the faint scratching beneath. Exhaustion drowned out disgust. Men who worked 18 hours in factories or on docks cared little who had slept before them. They lay down, pulled the blanket to their chins, and closed their eyes. If one compared it to modern life, it would be like renting a hotel room where the sheets are never washed and the previous guest has only just stepped out of bed. The difference is that for the Victorian poor, there was no other choice. The beds held more than warmth. They held stories of sickness, hunger, and quiet death. When someone died in a lodging house, the body was carried out and the bed reused before the night was over. No one spoke of infection or contagion. The living could not afford fear. They shared everything's space, breath, and whatever invisible poisons passed from one body to another. Some awoke to find their neighbours gone cold beside them. Others never woke at all. The air inside these houses was heavy and sour. Windows were sealed against the night wind, and candles smoked on the walls. The scent of sweat mixed with coal dust and the damp of unwashed bedding. The floors creaked beneath the weight of footsteps and dripping boots. At dawn, the room came alive with the noise of movement, coins clinking, beds creaking, doors slamming. By midday, new bodies had taken their place, and the rhythm began again. There was no beginning or end to it, only rotation. For women and children, the experience was harsher. Families too poor to rent separate rooms slept in the same quarters as strangers. Mothers curled around their children, trying to form a barrier between them and the unknown figures on the other side. In the dark, hands sometimes wandered. Many learned to sleep lightly, half awake, half aware. Still, the need for warmth outweighed the fear. The thin blankets covered shame as well as skin. These beds were not just breeding grounds for insects, but for disease. Typhus, tuberculosis, and influenza thrived in the close air. Doctors described these houses as fever nests, yet few efforts were made to close them. The poor were too many, and the alternatives too few. Authorities called it charity that such beds existed at all. To those who used them, it was survival disguised as sleep. Every object in these rooms told a story of repetition. The mattresses sagged under years of weight, the frames rusted from constant damp. The same thin pillow might cradle a dozen heads in a single week. The scratches on the walls, the stains on the floor, and the smell of bodies past clung to every surface. For the keepers of these houses, there was profit in endurance. The more a bed was used, the more money it earned. Cleaning it meant losing time, and time was money. There was a strange intimacy in such shared spaces. People who would never speak on the street slept inches apart, breathing each other's air. In the darkness, all differences dissolved. Worker and thief, woman and child, all wrapped in the same stale warmth. In the silence of the night, their breathing merged into a single weary rhythm. For a few hours, it almost resembled peace. But when morning came, they rose again, leaving behind a hollow warmth for the next stranger to claim. Victorian lodging houses turned sleep into a transaction, traded warmth between bodies as if it were currency. The idea of comfort faded before the simple need to endure. There is something quietly horrifying about rest that carries another's dirt, another's scent, another's sorrow. And when those borrowed beds began to crawl with more than insects, the thin line between rest and rot started to blur, revealing what truly shared the night with them. In the rented beds of Victorian towns, sleep itself became communal, shared among strangers and unseen creatures alike. The boundary between safety and sickness was as thin as the sheet that divided one sleeper from the next. But deeper within those homes, something even smaller and hungrier waited for its turn to feed. They were never truly alone in their beds. Beneath the folds of linen and within the seams of blankets, life stirred where warmth lingered. Bedbugs nested deep in the corners of straw mattresses, invisible by day and merciless by night. They crept out when the lamps went dark, feeding quietly and leaving trails of small red welts across arms, necks, and ankles. Fleas arrived from cats and dogs, finding their way into the layers of bedding through cloaks and skirts. Lice hid in seams, waiting for the brush of hair against a pillow. Sleep in Victorian England was not rest, but surrender to an army too small to fight. People accepted the bites as part of life. They scratched until skin broke and bled, then wrapped the wounds with cloth in the morning. For many, the itching never stopped. The poor lived in constant contact with these insects, and even the wealthy were not spared. The difference was only in how they described it. The rich called it irritation, the poor called it vermin. The word mattered more than the wound. It is strangely comical that Victorians built entire moral systems around cleanliness, yet slept each night as a feast for parasites. The insects thrived because the homes were perfect for them. Curtains, carpets, and heavy bedding offered endless hiding places. Fireplaces warmed the air just enough for breeding, and the smell of sweat drew them from every crack. Cleaning methods were crude, beating the mattress, boiling sheets, or brushing vinegar between seams, but none of it truly worked. The bugs returned every night, loyal as shadows. Sometimes people sprinkled camphor or lavender on their beds, hoping to chase the creatures away with scent alone. The perfume only made the air thicker, mixing sweetness with decay. In poorer homes, infestation was a visible part of daily life. Bedbugs crawled openly across walls, and fleas could be seen hopping over children's legs. Mothers crushed them between fingernails without stopping their conversation. The small corpses left brown smears on the walls, marks that never faded. When visitors came, the family simply brushed at their clothes, as if dusting away guilt. If one were to imagine it today, it would be like living in a home where the wallpaper itself moved, and everyone pretended not to notice. It sounds unthinkable. But to Victorians, it was routine. Doctors occasionally wrote about the biting plague of the cities. They described children too weak to heal from constant scratching, their skin dotted with sores that turned septic in the damp air. But such cases were dismissed as the price of poverty. The medical world focused on grander diseases: cholera, typhus, consumption. Insects were too small to matter. People learned to live with them the way they lived with soot, hunger, and cold. The body adjusted, the mind stopped questioning. The wealthy, for all their fine linens, were no safer. Their beds were larger, their curtains thicker, and their pests more numerous. Servants were often blamed for bringing the vermin, though it was the master's habits that fed them. The endless layers of velvet and wool never dried completely, trapping heat and sweat in their folds. Some households hired fumigators, who burned sulphur or tobacco in the rooms. The smoke killed a few insects and stained the rest of the furniture, but it offered the illusion of control. Like so many things in Victorian life, the appearance of cleanliness mattered more than the truth. Servants bore the worst of it. After tending their masters' rooms, they returned to shared quarters already alive with fleas. They slept lightly, waking to the sensation of crawling beneath their clothes. In the morning, they washed their hands and faces but could do little for the bites that covered their arms. The marks were badges of their station, visible proof of labour and exposure. Some rubbed ash or salt into the wounds to stop the itching, but the relief was brief. The insects always came back, drawn by warmth and helpless flesh. Animals played their part in the infestation. Cats and dogs roamed freely through houses, lying on beds and chairs. Their fur carried fleas that multiplied in every corner. In winter, when windows stayed closed and fires burned low, the creatures multiplied unchecked. Children often woke to find their legs dotted with bites and their pillows stained with blood. Yet these small torments were treated as ordinary. Cleanliness belonged to sermons, not to daily life. The strange intimacy of sharing a bed with insects became a quiet feature of existence. People joked about it the way they joked about the weather. They bite the clean more than the dirty, some said, convincing themselves that the irritation was proof of good hygiene. Others told themselves that scratching kept the blood healthy. The mind will accept almost anything when it has no power to change it. It is hard not to feel a chill when imagining how many nights were spent lying perfectly still, while hundreds of tiny mouths fed unseen. Over time, the insects became part of the rhythm of sleep. The first itching signaled that the night had begun. Scratching became an unconscious motion, like breathing. In the morning, people brushed off the dust of dead bugs, shook their bedding, and went about their day. There was no outrage, no urgency to fix what seemed unfixable. Entire generations lived and died with that quiet acceptance, carrying the marks of their invisible companions beneath layers of clothing and civility. Even in death, the bond was not broken. When a sleeper passed away, the insects did not leave, they simply waited. The warmth would fade, but the scent of the body remained, guiding them to the next living host. It was a small, constant cycle that mirrored the larger one of Victorian life: decay feeding life, and life decaying again. The Victorians believed they mastered their homes, yet their beds were ruled by creatures too small to see. Cleanliness was preached from pulpits, while filth thrived beneath blankets and lace. There is something both tragic and grotesque in how comfort and infestation could live side by side without question. And as the night stretched on, the sound of scratching grew louder, carrying whispers of another horror, one that did not crawl but bit deeper, hidden beneath the skin itself. The Victorians slept surrounded by their own invisible colonies, accepting each bite as the price of rest. The blood they lost in the dark marked the quiet union between filth and survival. But what happened when those unseen creatures began spreading more than discomfort, carrying sickness from bed to body without warning? Nightclothes in the Victorian age were not meant for beauty or even comfort. They were meant to endure. Made from linen or coarse cotton, they absorbed every trace of the day sweat, oil, dust, and were worn again and again until the fabric stiffened with residue. Washing them too often was considered wasteful, even dangerous, especially in winter when water was cold and drying took days. So people simply didn't. They hung their nightshirts near the fire, let the smoke mask the smell, and put them back on before bed as if smoke could cleanse what water did not. In time, the scent of unwashed cloth became the scent of home. The wealthy had finer versions silk trimmed with lace, cotton printed with tiny flower. Their habits were the same. Servants washed the garments only when the fabric yellowed or the odour grew too sharp to ignore. The rest of the time, the clothing was merely aired out. Families believed that the body's natural smell was a sign of health, proof that the system was open and breathing. Doctors even warned that overcleanliness might weaken the skin. It is darkly humorous that an empire so proud of its refinement believed filth was a form of vitality. The smell of sleep became a kind of personal perfume. Husbands and wives grew used to each other's scent, a blend of sweat, soot, and damp linen. Children were tucked into bed wearing garments that had not seen soap in weeks. In the cold months, the same flannel nightgown might be worn all season. When holes appeared, they were patched rather than replaced. The skin beneath adapted. Too, it grew tougher, darker, less sensitive. People spoke of a healthy glow, though it came not from purity but from the thin film of oil that sealed the pores. The poor, as always, suffered more visibly. They slept in whatever they owned, often in the same clothes they worked in during the day. Their garments were layered for warmth, stiff from grime, and rarely removed. Washing meant losing time, coal, and water, things more precious than cleanliness. In lodging houses, the smell of mingled bodies was thick and constant. When morning came, the same garments that had absorbed the night's sweat were worn to work again. Dirt was not an inconvenience, it was a part of life. If one compared it to today, it would be like sleeping every night in the same gym clothes for months, then calling the resulting odour a sign of good health. The image feels absurd, but to Victorians, it was entirely reasonable. Even among the upper classes, the situation was little better. Maids who handled laundry dreaded winter washing days. Steam filled the rooms, soaking walls and ceilings until mould appeared. Some households limited washing to 2 or 3 times a year to protect the house from damp air. Nightclothes, being private garments, were low on the list of priorities. The stains and odours were politely ignored, hidden beneath words like well-worn or familiar. Respectability was measured by appearance, not by scent. Sleeping in unwashed clothing brought its own quiet discomforts. The fabric chafed the skin and trapped heat, causing rashes that people called night fever. Parasites flourished in the seams, feasting on the residue of human skin. Women sometimes rubbed camphor or vinegar on their necks and wrists before bed, not realizing that the source of their itching lay inside the very fabric they wore. Men scratched at their collars and cuffs, believing it was the wool irritating them. The truth was simpler and far less respectable. There was a strange intimacy in these habits. A person's nightclothes carried the record of their body, the smell of labour, the texture of sleep, the faint dust of the streets. When they died, the garments often remained folded in drawers, still bearing the ghost of their scent. In some homes, widows refused to wash their late husband's clothes, as if the odour itself was sacred. Filth could become memory, and memory was too precious to scrub away. Doctors who visited the poor noticed the smell before anything else. They described rooms where the air was thick with human effluvia, where clothing and bedding steamed with the exhalations of the body. Yet few saw the connection between smell and sickness. The miasma theory, believing that disease came from bad air, ironically discouraged washing. If the air itself was poisonous, what good could soap do people learn to live within their own fumes? The servants who handled the laundry faced their own misery. They boiled linens in large copper tubs, scraping away hardened layers of dirt that floated to the surface like skin. The stench filled their lungs, clinging to their hair for days. Their hands cracked and bled from soap lye, but they were forbidden from complaining. Cleanliness, when it existed, was built on someone else's suffering. Even then, not everything could be washed. Nightgowns were sometimes too fragile and stains too deep. They were folded, perfumed, and stored for use again. The cycle was endless. Night after night, people slipped into garments that remembered everything. They carried yesterday's sweat, last week's illness, and last month's exhaustion. The body and fabric fused into one rhythm, bound by habit. To wash away the dirt would have been to wash away familiarity. And so, cleanliness remained a stranger in the very place meant for rest. Victorian nightwear was less about comfort and more about endurance, a quiet truce between the body and its own decay. The fabric absorbed life until it became a second skin that no one questioned. It is unsettling to realize how easily filth can turn into tradition when everyone agrees to stop noticing. And as the air in those rooms thickened with the scent of unwashed cloth, something far worse than odour began to take hold, an invisible presence born from the marriage of sweat, fabric, and time. The Victorians wrapped themselves each night in layers of their own history, mistaking the smell of stagnation for health. Every fibre of their nightclothes told the story of neglect disguised as necessity. But in the stillness of those unwashed beds, something unseen began to grow, turning fabric into a quiet threat. Victorian pillows were soft in appearance but foul in truth. Beneath the crisp white cases lay a dense core of feathers and down that had not been cleaned for years, sometimes decades. Pillowcases might be changed weekly, but the inner stuffing was left untouched, as though washing it would somehow destroy its spirit. The feathers inside soaked up everything the body gave off: sweat, oil, and hair, until they clumped together into damp knots. When pressed, the pillows exhaled a sour smell, the perfume of countless nights of sleep gone stale. To the Victorians, it was the smell of comfort, the scent of familiarity that no soap was meant to remove. Each night, the head returned to the same hollow spot where it had rested for years. The pillow remembered every dream, every fever, every tear. A proper household prided itself on plump pillows, yet few cared how they were kept that way. New feathers were expensive, and the task of the washing old ones was messy and long. Instead, they were merely fluffed and turned, giving the illusion of freshness. The decay was hidden, tucked beneath clean linen and polite silence. It is grimly ironic that the very thing meant to cradle the head in peace was also a slow collector of filth and life. The stuffing inside these pillows was alive in more ways than one. Dust mites bred within the folds, feeding on flakes of skin. Insects that escaped fumigation in the mattress often migrated upward, burrowing into the seams. People scratched in their sleep, convinced that the itching came from the night air. Some woke to find tiny black dots on their pillowcases, specks of dried blood or crushed pests from the night before. Still, they laid their heads down again. Habit was stronger than disgust. The poor rarely owned feather pillows at all. They slept on sacks stuffed with straw or rags, which grew hard and flat after years of use. When they did manage to buy an old pillow from a wealthier household, It came already stained with another person's life. The smell was proof of its age, and the weight of it proof of its quality. Washing it would have seemed unthinkable. The feathers, after all, were thought to lose their warmth if soaked. If one compared it to today, it would be like inheriting someone's unwashed pillow after decades of use and calling the smell homely. The thought turns the stomach, yet to the Victorians it was thrift. Even in grand houses, pillows were rarely emptied. Servants were tasked with beating them out on sunny days, sending clouds of dust into the air that glittered like gold until it settled on everything nearby. The scent that followed was mistaken for freshness. In truth, it was the smell of disturbed skin cells and decomposed oils rising into the light. Those same servants went to bed on thin cushions that never saw sunlight at all. They inhaled dust from the master's comfort through every hour of their own sleep. Physicians who visited homes of every class spoke of pillow sickness. They suspected that unwashed bedding caused respiratory troubles, but their warnings were met with polite disbelief. The idea that something invisible could cause harm was still new. Pillows looked soft, and softness was assumed to be clean. When illness struck, people blamed the weather, not the things that touched their faces each night. A cough or fever was treated with tonics, never with soap. Over time, the feathers broke down, crushed by the weight of countless heads. The inside turned dark and sticky, packed with oil and dust until it was more sludge than stuffing. Still, families kept them. Mothers passed them to daughters as part of household dowries. They were described as well-seasoned, as if years of contact had improved them. The truth was that every generation slept in the waste of the one before. When the pillows grew too flat to use, they were not discarded but restuffed with whatever was at hand: scraps of wool, dried grass, even shredded paper. The mixture rustled faintly when touched. Some people spoke of it as the sound of rest. In reality, it was the whisper of decay. Feathers that once lifted with air now clumped together in damp balls that never dried fully. In rainy seasons, mildew crept in, leaving faint green stains along the seams. The smell became sour, but a few drops of rosewater could disguise it. The pillow's weight increased with time, as though it carried the burden of every night it had endured. Those who slept upon it often woke with stiff necks, the fabric cold and greasy beneath their hair. But comfort was not questioned. It was endured. The Victorians believed that rest came from stillness, not from cleanliness. They lay down on what they had, confident that time alone could not make something unfit for sleep. The same ignorance that protected the pillow's filth also protected its symbolism. It was a domestic object, part of the moral centre of the home. Cleanliness belonged to the body, not the things that served it. Housewives took pride in neat pillowcases and smooth bedspreads, their white perfection covering what they chose not to see. Every night, the body met its own history, pressed into the same feathers that had caught years of breath, oil, and loss. The Victorian pillow was a quiet archive of decay, pressed close to the face of those who called themselves civilized. The smell of its years was mistaken for comfort, and the weight of its filth mistaken for quality. It is unsettling to imagine how something so intimate could hold so much of life's residue and still be called pure. And in the still air of those dark bedrooms, the scent that rose from the pillows began to carry more than memory, it began to carry disease, one breath at a time. Victorian pillows held more than feathers. They held the traces of every breath, every fever, and every forgotten night. Beneath their softness, life and death mixed in silence, pressing against the skin of those who slept. As the air thickened with that quiet decay, something unseen began to drift through the house, carrying the ghosts of every sleeper who had ever lain there. The Victorian night was sealed shut. When darkness fell, windows were latched, curtains drawn, and air trapped within rooms already heavy from the day. People feared the chill more than the stench. It was believed that the night breeze carried illness that a single gust could strike the lungs, stiffen the chest, and bring on death by morning. Mothers scolded children for standing near open panes. Servants were ordered to fasten every window tight. The night air was the enemy, and so the house became its own small world, closed off and breathing only itself. Inside, the atmosphere thickened. The same air moved between bodies, warmed by breath and sweat, cooled only by exhaustion. The walls absorbed it, the furniture held it, and by midnight the rooms pulsed with a damp heat that clung to skin. In such stillness, even the faintest movement stirred the scent of humanity-old blankets, unwashed linen, oil from hair and skin. Yet no one dared to open a window. It is morbidly funny that a society so obsessed with etiquette and purity believed that fresh air itself was indecent. Doctors encouraged these fears. They spoke of night chills, of winds that crept into bones and turned warmth into weakness. Ventilation was labelled reckless, and open windows became a mark of ignorance. To the Victorian mind, safety meant stillness, and stillness meant virtue. So people locked their windows as carefully as their doors, trusting the stagnant air more than the living breeze. They fell asleep to the smell of their own confinement, convinced it was protection. In the poorer quarters of cities like London or Manchester, these fears were even stronger. The streets outside reeked of smoke, sewage, and decay. To open a window was to invite the city in. Tenements stood shoulder to shoulder, their walls sweating with damp, their windows stuffed with rags to block the draught. Inside, the air shimmered with the heat of coal fires and unwashed bodies. Families coughed through the night, sharing breath until it became indistinguishable whose lungs the air had already passed through. If one imagined it today, it would be like sealing every window in a crowded apartment, turning the home into a slow furnace that recycled its own fumes. It sounds unbearable, but it was considered prudent. The wealthy mirrored the poor in their fear, though for different reasons. Their homes were draped in heavy velvet curtains and thick brocade, meant to keep warmth from escaping and prying eyes from seeing in. The windows were ornamental, not functional. Air was a thing to be looked at, not invited. When guests complained of the heat, hosts smiled politely and claimed it was healthy. The scent of perfumed candles and human closeness filled the air, creating a sweetness that turned sour by morning. Still, they considered it refinement. The superstition against night air ran deep. Stories circulated of people who had left a window open and woken with a chill in the chest that never left them. A cold draught was blamed for everything from stiff joints to madness. The body, they believed, was a fragile vessel that could be undone by air itself. Curtains were drawn thick, blankets tucked under chins, and doors sealed. The silence that followed was suffocating. The only sounds were breathing, and sometimes coughing. As the industrial age filled cities with smoke, the fear of the outdoors grew stronger. People looked out through glass darkened by soot and told themselves that the danger was out there, not within. The irony was bitter inside their homes. The air grew more poisonous with each hour. Candles burned the oxygen thin. Fires ate what remained, and still they refused to open a window. The night breeze might have brought relief, but they preferred safety to comfort, superstition to breath. Servants suffered most. They slept in attics or basements, where air barely moved at all. The heat from the kitchens below rose into their narrow rooms, and the only window, if there was one, was painted shut. They woke drenched in sweat, their heads pounding from the closeness. Yet if a maid dared to crack a pane, she risked being accused of inviting illness into the house. So she endured, night after night, breathing what others had already exhaled. By morning, the air had a texture. It pressed against the face when one rose from bed, thick with moisture and the scent of sleep. Curtains were drawn back, and the illusion of freshness returned. The smell dissipated slightly, but never entirely. Over time, it soaked into the very walls, into the plaster, into the minds of those who lived there. The Victorians spoke often of progress, but their homes remained tombs of their own making, sealed, stale, and unbreathing. It is difficult not to picture them now, lying motionless under layers of fabric, surrounded by air that had not moved in years. They believed that stillness meant safety, that breath unshared was purity. Yet in that very stillness, sickness thrived. Colds deepened into coughs, coughs into consumption, and still the windows stayed shut. The line between warmth and decay blurred, hidden behind curtains that never swayed. The Victorians trusted their walls more than the wind, believing that still air could keep them alive. The same air that carried their breath carried their sickness, yet they called it protection. Something is haunting in the idea of sleeping peacefully while slowly suffocating on one's own safety. And as the rooms filled with the ghosts of 1,000 nights of trapped breath, the air itself began to change, thickening into something far more dangerous than a passing chill. In their fear of the night air, Victorians turned their homes into sealed chambers where warmth and rot became indistinguishable. Every breath recycled the memory of the night before. When sickness began to spread through those silent rooms, it was not the wind that carried death, it was the air they refused to let go. Perfume in the Victorian home was not a symbol of luxury alone, it was a disguise. Beneath the layers of silk curtains and polished wood, there lingered the smell of people, the warmth of unwashed skin, the sweetness of old linen, the faint tang of sickness that never left the rooms. Washing heavy blankets was a task few households attempted, so the solution was simple. Instead of removing the odour, they drowned it. Perfume bottles were brought out each morning, and a fine mist was sprayed across the beds, into the air, and along the folds of curtains. The fragrance was sweet, rich, and suffocating, settling over decay like paint on a crumbling wall. The habit became both a ritual and a necessity. Housewives took pride in the scent of their bedrooms, describing them as fresh or civilized. Guests who entered would comment on the fragrance before anything else, unaware that the smell came not from cleanliness but from concealment. Beneath the perfume, the blankets were stiff with sweat and oil, the sheets stained with years of sleep. The rich favoured heavy floral scents rose, violet and jasmine, while the poor used cheaper mixtures of alcohol and musk bought from street vendors. It is almost absurd that in an age obsessed with moral purity, the one kind of purity they avoided was literal. Perfume was everywhere in linen closets, on pillows, inside gloves and drawers. Bottles stood proudly beside wash basins that rarely saw water. The scent was a shield against the truth, a sweet weapon to fight against the evidence of neglect. But the chemicals used were far from harmless. Many perfumes contained arsenic, mercury salts, or lead compounds to preserve the scent and intensify its strength. The alcohol burned the skin, and the oils clogged pores already heavy with dirt. Women who sprayed perfume onto their necks before bed often woke with red welts that never healed completely. Still, they continued. To sleep in a bed that smelled of roses was to believe, if only for a moment, that the room was clean. In crowded towns where water was scarce and washing costly, perfume became the smell of survival. The poor could not afford the imported bottles used by the wealthy, but they made their own steeping herbs or mixing spirits with camphor. The result was sharp, acrid, and dizzying, but better than the stink of mould and sweat. Lodging houses stank of it. The air hung heavy with overlapping scents, cheap musk, lamp oil, and human breath. People coughed as they entered, but they still described it as pleasant. Habit dulled the senses. What mattered was the illusion of refinement. The wealthy lived in more fragrant prisons. Their beds were draped with velvet covers that could not be washed without ruining the fabric. Instead, servants were ordered to refresh them with perfume. The women of the house often chose their own scents and preferred lavender, others orange blossom. Each carried its own meaning. Lavender was thought to bring calm, rose to symbolize grace and musk to signal sensuality. Yet no scent could mask what time revealed. When the fire burned low at night and the warmth drew the hidden smells from fabric, the air thickened again with the unmistakable odour of the human body. If one compared it to today, it would be like spraying luxury perfume over weeks of unwashed sheets and calling the result cleanliness. The image may seem grotesque, but to Victorians, it was elegance. Perfume makers thrived on these habits. They advertised their products as protectors of health, claiming that certain scents purified the air. Some even promised that their mixtures could ward off disease. People believed them. A spritz of violet water became a charm against cholera. A few drops of rose essence were said to soothe the lungs. The irony was cruel. These perfumes contained chemicals far more harmful than the air they replaced. Skin rashes, fainting, and headaches became common, but they were dismissed as signs of nerves or weak constitutions. In the homes of the poor, the attempt at imitation was even more desperate. Some burned dried flowers on stoves to create a pleasant smell. Others soaked rags in vinegar and waved them through the air. The smoke mixed with soot, leaving black streaks on the walls. Yet when the scent lingered, families felt proud. Their homes, for a brief moment, smelled like those of their betters. The deception brought comfort. In an era when cleanliness marked class, perfume was the poor man's soap. The truth beneath the fragrance was unrelenting. The same blankets that smelled of jasmine also carried the stench of mildew. The same air that shimmered with rosewater held the rot of human waste from nearby streets. Perfume did not cleanse, it only blended. Those who lived in such spaces became so accustomed to the mixture that they could no longer tell one smell from another. The line between decay and luxury blurred until they became the same. Servants bore the brunt of this delusion. Each morning they beat the bedding to release the trapped air, coughing as clouds of dust and fragrance filled their lungs. Their hands burned from the alcohol in the mixtures. They learned to breathe shallowly while spraying to avoid dizziness. Some fainted during their chores, overcome by fumes. Yet no one questioned the practice. To have a house that smelled of roses was proof of respectability. No matter how it was achieved, perfume also became a mask for sickness. When a member of the family fell ill, the bedroom was often filled with stronger scents to disguise the smell of fever. The curtains were drawn, candles lit, and perfume applied in generous sprays. Doctors entered these rooms and were met not by the odour of infection, but by the overwhelming sweetness of flowers. It dulled their senses, hiding the truth until it was too late. Death smelled beautiful in those houses. By night, the air inside these rooms grew thick and strange. The perfume, once pleasant, became cloying under the heat of the fire. The smell of roses turned bitter, the musk heavy, the lavender sharp as metal. The people sleeping beneath it breathed in their own disguise, letting it sink into their hair and skin. The body absorbed the toxins, turning the illusion of beauty into a slow poisoning. Still, they dreamed of refinement, never realizing how close that dream lay to decay. When morning came, they woke surrounded by the same scent that had lulled them to sleep. The perfume lingered in the curtains, in their hair, in their throats. It was both comforting and oppressive, like the presence of someone they could not escape. They called it cleanliness, civility, class. But in truth, it was simply another form of dirtone that smelled expensive. Perfume did not purify the Victorian home, it embalmed it, turning every room into a sweetened tomb. The scent of luxury mixed with the odour of life until death itself began to smell pleasant. There is something deeply unsettling in the idea of people sleeping soundly inside the fragrance of their own decay. And as the air thickened with that artificial sweetness, the boundary between the living and the dead grew thin, marked only by the faint perfumed breath that lingered through the night. The Victorians covered their filth with fragrance, mistaking the scent of roses for the promise of purity. Each spray buried the truth a little deeper beneath layers of deceit and sweet decay. When those scents began to cling to the dead as well as the living, the illusion of beauty finally revealed what it had been hiding all along. Before the invention of springs, the bed was little more than a sack on a wooden frame. The mattress, as people called it, was a heavy bag stuffed with straw, dried moss, or scraps of old cloth. It was the simplest form of comfort, a barrier between the body and the cold wood beneath. To the Victorians, this was enough. The sight of a filled mattress meant security, no matter what lay inside. The straw was renewed only rarely, once when newly married, perhaps again when moving house. For most, it stayed untouched, growing darker and heavier with each passing year. Sleep was not rest, but a quiet truce with what shared the bed. Each movement at night stirred the air. When a person rolled over, fine dust rose from the seams and hung in the candlelight like smoke. The first breath after settling into bed carried the faint, dry taste of straw and the musk of years-old sweat. Beneath the weight of blankets, the sound of shifting hay whispered softly a lullaby of decay. Children sometimes pressed their faces into the mattress and coughed from the dryness. Still, families called it comfort. It is darkly amusing that the Victorians could mistake the smell of rot for the scent of home. The straw mattress was a fragile thing. It flattened quickly under the body's weight, leaving a hollow where the sleeper lay. The edges grew hard, the middle damp. In winter, the moisture never dried, feeding mould that spread in grey rings beneath the surface. People covered these stains with linen, smoothing the sheet to hide what lay below. What could not be seen could be ignored. A well-made bed, after all, was a sign of decency, even if it reeked faintly of mildew. Rags were sometimes added when the straw began to thin. They were pieces of discarded clothing, old curtains, or whatever fabric could be spared. The result was lumpy and uneven, but it stretched the mattress's life. The poor relied on such patchwork beds, convinced that the closeness of their own discarded garments made the bed more personal. The irony was cruel. Their comfort came from the same cloth that had once soaked up sweat and soot during the day. The smell of labour followed them into their dreams. If one compared it to modern life, it would be like sleeping on a cushion stuffed with months of dirty laundry, calling it warmth instead of waste. Yet to them, it was normal. The insects found paradise in those layers. Fleas and bedbugs slipped between the folds, their tiny bodies hiding among the hay. They waited for nightfall, sensing the heat of human skin. Every twitch of movement, every sigh, was a signal that the feast had begun. In the dark, sleepers felt pinpricks on their legs and necks, but rarely woke fully. Scratching became part of slumber. By morning, blood had spotted the sheets, and still, the beds went unshaken. Habit and exhaustion kept the truth at bay. For the servants who cared for these beds, there was little they could do. Their duty was to make the beds look inviting, not to cleanse them. Each morning, they lifted the sheets, beat the corners, and turned the straw-filled mattress over to hide the flattening. Clouds of dust filled the room, carrying the faint smell of sweat and hay. When sunlight passed through it, the air glittered with the residue of human life. Servants coughed quietly, then spread new sheets and smoothed them flat. The illusion of freshness was restored, and the day went on. In grander homes, the mattresses were larger but no cleaner. The wealthy preferred moss to straw. Believing it softer, it was softer, but it held moisture more easily, turning sour with the first hint of damp weather. The smell was masked with perfume sachets, which only made it worse. The sweet, heavy fragrance of lavender mixed with the odour of mould until the air grew almost metallic. Visitors might admire the bed's size or the embroidery on its cover, never realising the decay beneath. The Victorians worshipped appearance, even in sleep. Replacing the straw was considered wasteful and superstitious. Some believed that changing it too often might invite sickness, that a mattress used to a body could not be safely disturbed. Some families slept on the same filling for decades, swearing it brought good luck. Even when the straw broke down into dust, they only added new handfuls on top. Over time, the bed became a record of their lives' dust from skin, sweat from fever, and hair from every member of the family mingling together in a silent archive. The bed did not just hold the body, it held the history of the house. Doctors who visited the sick sometimes blamed their beds. They noticed that the ill often worsened after long nights in musty mattresses, yet their warnings went unheard. Replacing the straw cost money and effort, two things few were willing to spare. And so, the sick kept lying in the same warm nests of mould and mites, breathing the same dust that deepened their fevers. Death in such a bed was slow, but it felt familiar, and that made it bearable. When the bodies finally left, the bed remained. The straw inside was turned over, the linen replaced, and a new sleeper took the place of the old. Nothing was discarded. Death, like dirt, was absorbed. The next person who lay there slept soundly, unaware that every breath pressed deeper into the dust of those who came before. The air inside those rooms grew heavier with time, thick with the mingled sense of life and decay. The mattress sagged, the straw broke down, and still it was called a bed. By the end of the century, spring mattresses appeared, promising comfort and cleanliness, but many clung to the old ways. Springs were noisy, strange, and foreign. The straw bed felt real, honest, and familiar. It was part of their past, and to abandon it was to abandon tradition itself. So they slept on, wrapped in the remnants of themselves. The straw mattresses of that age were not just places of rest, but slow graves of their own making. Each breath stirred the dust of lives already half forgotten, turning comfort into quiet contamination. It is unnerving to imagine how willingly people lay their heads upon decay and called it home. And as the dust rose from beneath their bodies, something unseen began to move with it. Silent tide of sickness drifting from the bed into the air they breathed. People of that age trusted their straw-filled beds as symbols of simplicity, unaware that they slept on layers of slow rot. Each sigh of rest carried the faint stir of dust and life beneath them. As illness began to spread from bed to body, no one suspected that comfort itself was the cause. By the end of each day, the Victorian foot carried the entire world upon it. Mud from cobbled streets, soot from factory smoke, and waste from horse-drawn carriages clung to the soles like a second skin. Yet when night came, those same feet were lifted onto beds dressed in white sheets, welcomed without question. Washing before sleep was not a ritual of the poor. It was an extravagance for those with servants, basins, and enough water to spare. The rest believed that wiping one's feet upon the floor before climbing into bed was good enough. To them, dirt was not a danger, it was a companion that followed wherever life went. Water was cold, scarce, and heavy to draw from a well. Heating it required coal or wood, both precious commodities. So many simply skipped the task. They went to bed as they were, the day's grime pressed against the same sheets that had absorbed last night's sweat. The smell was faintly sour but familiar, like the scent of work itself. Some called it earthy, as if it were a sign of resilience rather than neglect. It is almost comical that people who feared fresh air saw no harm in bringing the entire street to bed with them. In poorer homes, the floor itself was often damp with soil and ash. People walked barefoot indoors, carrying the grit of the city into every room. Their feet were cracked from labour, the skin thickened and dark. Children's toes were blackened by dust, and no one thought it strange. To wash them daily was considered indulgent, something fit only for nobles or the idle rich. Clean feet were a symbol of privilege, not hygiene. If one imagined it today, it would be like considering a nightly shower a sign of arrogance rather than necessity. The idea of sleeping clean simply did not exist for most. The dirt that gathered beneath toenails and between toes was more than visible grime. It carried the traces of city life coal soot, manure, and oil from the streets. When people lay down at night, those particles transferred easily to the sheets. Within a few nights, the bedding was streaked with faint brown marks where feet had rested. Over time, these stains became part of the fabric, permanent reminders of every day lived and every night ignored. The smell, a mix of dust and skin, seeped into the room. To visitors, it was unpleasant. To the family, it was home. There was also superstition in their neglect. Many believed that washing the feet at night could draw illness into the body. Warm water opened the pores, they said, allowing sickness to enter. Cold water was worse, it might shock the blood and bring fever. These beliefs persisted even among those who could afford cleanliness. The effort of drawing water was reason enough not to challenge tradition. So they climbed into bed with feet wrapped in the day's journey, confident that stillness would cleanse what water could not. Doctors occasionally wrote about the dangers of this habit, linking skin infections and strange fevers to dirty feet. But few listened. A doctor's words could not compete with old sayings passed down through families. "Let the dirt rest with you," they said, "and it will leave with the morning." Of course, it never did. The dirt accumulated quietly, layering into the fabric, the mattress, and even the air. By winter, when people rarely left their beds, the entire household began to smell faintly of the streets outside. In wealthier homes, the situation was only marginally better. Servants were often too exhausted at day's end to fetch hot water for their masters, so they used perfume or powders instead. A few drops of rose water dabbed at the ankles gave the illusion of freshness. Beneath that, the same grime remained. Carpets near the bed grew grey from contact, and slippers darkened where bare heels slipped into them. The more polite the household, the more determined it was to hide what lingered beneath appearances. Children learned early that washing feet was unnecessary. Their mothers told them to dry them instead, or to dust them with powder if they smelled too strong. The result was a thin crust of dirt sealed with starch. In summer, when the air grew hot, that mixture cracked and flaked off during sleep. The flakes drifted into the sheets, mingling with dust and sweat. Every morning began with a layer of yesterday beneath the skin. Those who worked near rivers or wells occasionally rinsed their feet before bed, but this was rare and usually done out of necessity rather than cleanliness. Labourers who stood in mud all day simply wanted relief from pain, not purity. Their washing was brief, hurried, and done with water already grey from use. Then they climbed into bed, feet still damp, and left dark prints that spread with every restless turn. For some, the act of washing before sleep carried an air of vanity. Who do you think you, our neighbours, might say if they saw someone fetching water late at night? Cleanliness was associated with arrogance, with pretending to be above one's station, and so the poor learned to wear their dirt with pride, as proof of labour and humility. They dreamed in the smell of sweat and soil, unaware that each night's rest buried them deeper into quiet filth. By morning, the grime had dried into fine dust, settling across the room like ash. When the first light entered through the cracks in the window, it revealed the truth. Grey streaks across the sheets, smudges at the foot of the bed, and faint outlines of toes that had walked miles. The room breathed it in and exhaled it again, an endless cycle of human dust. And yet, for all its filth, this was life as they knew it, honest, humble, and untouched by vanity. For those who lived in that time, unwashed feet were not a failure of hygiene but a badge of endurance. The dirt beneath their soles told stories of labour, hunger, and survival that no water could erase. There is something both tragic and absurd in the idea that sleep itself became an extension of the streets. And as the dust from their feet settled deeper into the fabric of their homes, it began to blend with something far worse, the sickness that slept beside them and never left. They carried the dirt of the streets into their sleep, wrapping the day's grime in the folds of their sheets. That quiet neglect turned rest itself into an invisible contagion, spreading through every corner of the home. As bodies began to share more than warmth beneath the same blanket, what passed between them was no longer just comfort, but something far more perilous. Illness in the Victorian home did not come with isolation. When a member of the family fell sick, they remained in the same bed they had always shared. There were no spare rooms, no separate bedding, and rarely any understanding of contagion. The sick slept beside the healthy, their fevered breaths warming the same air, their sweat soaking into the same sheets. The idea of sleeping alone seemed cruel, almost inhuman. To care for someone meant to stay close, to share their discomfort as if distance were betrayal. And so, entire families inhaled sickness together, wrapped in blankets that smelled faintly of illness and affection. When one person coughed through the night, others turned their faces toward the wall but did not move away. The sound became part of the rhythm of sleep, like the creak of the bed frame or the sigh of the fire. Children reached for their mother's hand beneath the covers, unaware that the same touch carried disease. Fathers comforted wives with damp cloths, then used the same to wipe their own faces. The sheets beneath them grew heavy with fever, their warmth deceptive. It is grimly ironic that compassion, in those rooms, was often the first step toward infection. The bedding was rarely changed. Fresh linen was expensive, and washing during illness was thought to weaken the body further. The same pillow that caught a sick child's sweat one night held another's face the next. Towels and rags moved from one person to another, all under the belief that cleanliness belonged to vanity, not care. What mattered was keeping the patient warm, not clean. The scent of sickness, sweet, metallic, and earthy, clung to every blanket. It soaked into the fabric until the smell of fever became the smell of home. Doctors who visited these houses often found entire families struck by the same illness. They prescribed tonics, poultices, and prayers, but said little about distance. Few believed in invisible causes. Disease was considered a matter of constitution, of weak blood or bad luck. If one person fell ill, the rest were seen as fated to follow. In that fatalism lay the quiet acceptance of shared suffering. People did not fear contagion because they did not recognize it. They feared being alone. If one imagined it today, it would be like sleeping beside someone with a contagious fever and calling it devotion. Yet to them, it was love. The poor had little choice. A single bed often served an entire household. When sickness came, it spread like water through fabric slow, invisible, unstoppable. A mother might die in the same sheets where her child had been born. A husband recovering from fever might find his wife trembling beside him days later. The mattress remembered them all, its layers darkened by sweat, its surface marked by the outlines of countless nights of suffering. Still, it was never washed, only turned over, the other side deemed clean. Among the wealthy, things were no better in truth. Although they had spare rooms, they often chose not to use them. A sick relative was kept close for comfort and convenience. Servants brought trays of broth and wine, setting them on tables already crowded with medicine bottles. The air was thick with perfume meant to disguise the smell of infection, but underneath lingered the unmistakable odour of decay. Curtains remained drawn, sealing in the heat and the sickness. Those who attended the ill breathed deeply of the same air, their care quietly killing them. Some families viewed illness as a test of faith. To endure beside the sick was an act of moral strength. Mothers pressed their lips to the foreheads of feverish children, whispering prayers that mingled with coughs. Fathers held hands gone cold, refusing to let go until the body beneath the covers stopped moving. Then, when death came, the bed was not emptied or burned, it was remade. The same sheets were shaken out, the same blankets smoothed, and life resumed. The dead left behind their warmth, their scent, their invisible trace. The living lay down again as though nothing had changed. Even after death, the bedding was treated as property, not hazard. Neighbours borrowed blankets for their own sick children. The logic was simple. A warm blanket was a blessing, no matter whose body had last used it. They could not afford to waste fabric, nor did they see danger in the invisible. What could not be seen could not harm them, or so they thought. And so, each act of kindness became a quiet exchange of disease, carried from house to house by the softness of cloth. In cities, outbreaks of fever and consumption spread rapidly through narrow streets. Entire tenements fell ill within weeks, and the beds themselves became instruments of contagion. The authorities spoke of filth and morality, blaming the poor for their suffering. But even the wealthy, with all their washing and perfumes, could not escape the same fate. Sickness thrived in stillness, in warmth, in the shared breath of family devotion. No amount of linen could protect against what moved unseen between bodies. By morning, the sick rooms reeked of sweat and vinegar, of flowers and fever. The light that filtered through the curtains revealed stains that no washing could erase. Each mark was a memory of touch of comfort given, of lives intertwined. The Victorians prided themselves on endurance, and so they endured, even when their love became a poison they could not name. To share a bed with the ill was to share their fate, and yet few questioned it. Love was stronger than fear, ignorance stronger than reason. It is disturbing to imagine how tenderly death entered those homes, dressed in the gestures of care. And as the bodies pressed closer for warmth, the sickness that slept among them learned to move faster, hungrier, and closer to the heart of every home. They believed comfort could heal, even when comfort itself carried the disease. The closer they drew to one another, the faster sickness spread through their rooms. As their beds turned into silent battlegrounds of breath and fever, a new kind of contamination began to thrive in the dark. In the quiet hours of Victorian nights, beds were open, plain sun protected, uncovered, and alive. There were no nets, no gauze curtains, nothing to keep the outside world from crawling in. The air moved slowly in those sealed rooms, thick and heavy, and every flicker of a candle revealed what shared the darkness. Flies circled above the pillows, drawn by the warmth of breath. Moths brushed against faces in the dark, and beneath the folds of the blanket, other things stirred small, quiet, and waiting. Sleep in that age was never private. The bed stood bare against the night, their wooden frames cool to the touch, their sheets faintly damp with the heat of the day. Without coverings, the human body became an open invitation to anything that moved. Fleas, flies, and mosquitoes found their way easily through cracks in the windows and settled upon still skin. A person could wake with red bites across their arms, a swollen eyelid, or the faint buzz of something trapped inside their ear. Some wrote of waking to the feeling of legs moving against their necks. Others never woke at all. It is grimly absurd that in a time obsessed with modesty, people slept exposed to every crawling thing the dark could offer. In rural areas, insects came from the fields. In cities, they came from the streets. Open sewers, stables, and food stalls bred clouds of flies that drifted into homes through open doors and chimneys. Once inside, they did not leave. They hid in folds of curtains, beneath pillow seams, and in the corners of ceilings. When night fell, the scent of sweat and breath drew them to the beds. Families slept with hands tucked beneath blankets, afraid of what brushed against their skin. Children whimpered softly, but exhaustion always won. The dark did not care about fear. Without mosquito nets, disease travelled easily. Summer fevers swept through entire households, carried by insects that moved silently from one bed to another. The poor blamed bad air, while doctors blamed the poor. Neither could see what truly bit them. If one imagined it today, it would be like leaving every window open beside a pile of rotting garbage and wondering why sleep came with fever. Yet in the Victorian home, such things were considered natural, inevitable, even character-building. To endure discomfort was to prove one's strength. The wealthy believed their thick curtains and perfumes offered protection. In reality, those velvet drapes trapped insects inside, sealing them in the same warm darkness as their owners. The sweet smell of lavender and rosewater only masked the stench of decay long enough for the night to begin again. Ladies awoke with small welts across their necks and wrists, convinced they had brushed against rough lace. Servants saw the truth but said nothing. Their own beds, in basements or attics, were worse filled with spiders, lice, and beetles that fed on crumbs and skin. During the warm months, the invasion grew worse. Mosquitoes whined through the night, their high-pitched buzz impossible to escape. People covered their faces with blankets despite the heat, choosing suffocation over exposure. Some burned herbs or sulphur to drive the insects away, filling the air with choking smoke. Others hung damp cloth scented with vinegar, believing the smell would repel pests. Nothing truly worked. By morning, bodies bore the marks of the night's visitors, and the air reeked of both sweat and desperation. The lack of protection was not only about ignorance but about cost. Nets required fabric, sewing, and maintenance, all things that consumed time and money. The poor could not afford such luxuries. Even those who knew their value saw them as symbols of vanity. A person who slept beneath a net was mocked for softness, for fearing the ordinary discomforts of life. So they endured, scratching until the skin broke, dabbing bites with vinegar or spit, and calling the pain a part of living. Reports from doctors and travellers described horrifying scenes. They told of insects crawling from mouths and nostrils of those too weak to wake, of maggots found in the ears of fevered children. Yet such accounts were treated as curiosities, not warnings. Pestilence was a companion, not an invader. To share a bed with the living and the crawling alike was part of existence itself. People joked that even the insects preferred company. They were wrong, of course. The insects preferred blood. In tenements and workhouses, the problem reached its peak. The combination of sweat, rot, and human heat created perfect breeding grounds. The walls pulsed faintly with movement if one dared to watch long enough. Sheets crawled when lifted, pillows squirmed when pressed, and yet, after a few moments of disgust, the resident simply went to bed. The body learns to ignore what it cannot change. Sleep was a surrender to necessity, not comfort. In the silence of the night, the rhythm of sleep and feeding intertwined. The faint hum of wings replaced the lullaby. In the morning, the sun revealed the aftermath tiny dots of dried blood on the sheets, trails of insects retreating into the cracks. Mothers brushed them away as they were dust. Fathers shrugged and dressed for work. The cycle began again that evening. Survival dulled horror into habit. To sleep without protection was to sleep with the world itself, every creeping, biting piece of it. The human body was both bed and banquet, both host and victim. There is something deeply unsettling in how easily people learn to mistake endurance for peace. And as the nights grew longer and the buzzing more relentless, something else began to stir in those restless rooms. Sickness that moved not with sound, but with silence. They slept uncovered, letting the darkness press against their skin until it no longer felt foreign. Every bite and sting became part of the rhythm of their nights. When fevers began to bloom in those unprotected beds, the true cost of their endurance crept into their blood. Dust was the first and last thing to greet a sleeper in the Victorian home. It lay on every surface, fine and grey, settled from the smoke of fires, the fibres of worn fabric, and the slow shedding of human skin. Beds, though the most intimate places in the house, were never free of it. People lifted their blankets each night and climbed in without a thought, disturbing clouds too small to see. The dust rose silently, hung in the candlelight like mist, and then drifted back down to rest on pillows and mouths. To them, this was not dirt, it was simply air. Each breath carried what the day had left behind. Dust from coal fires, from city streets, from the shoes and hair of every person who had passed through the room. When the bed creaked under the body's weight, a faint haze lifted, stirred by the warmth. In the stillness, it shimmered like frost before disappearing again into the darkness. The lungs did not distinguish between air and ash. The coughs that broke the silence of the night were dismissed as dryness, as the price of winter, never as warning. It is almost absurd that people could fear ghosts but sleep peacefully inside clouds of their own making. No one thought to beat the bed before sleep. Beating was work, and work belonged to the day. The bed was a sanctuary, not a task. Housewives prided themselves on neatly tucked corners and smooth sheets, not on cleanliness. Servants, too tired from endless chores, had no time to shake out what no one could see. They turned the blankets back, fluffed the pillows, and called it done. Dust had no colour, no voice, it existed quietly, and so it was ignored. The layer that gathered was more than ordinary dirt. It was made of lives lived indoors, tiny flakes of skin, threads of fabric, soot from fires, and fragments of hair mixed into a soft, grey veil that rested over everything. Each night it clung to the moist surface of lips, eyelids, and nostrils. In the morning, a faint line of grime marked the place where head met pillow. The first task of the day was to wipe it away, not to wonder where it came from. If one imagined it today, it would be like breathing the residue of one's own life and calling it harmless. Yet to the Victorians, that stillness was comfort itself. Dust was everywhere in their homes. The coal that heated the fires sent fine black particles through the air. Carpets trapped it, curtains held it, and bedding absorbed it. It floated invisibly from room to room, linking the sick to the healthy, the dying to the living. When a person fell ill in one bed, the air of the entire house seemed to darken. The same dust that carried warmth also carried disease, though no one yet understood. They saw dust as lifeless, unaware that it was alive with everything they had tried to forget. At night, as bodies turned in sleep, the motion stirred the surface. A faint shimmer rose above the blankets, invisible in darkness but thick enough to feel in the throat. People woke coughing, their eyes watering, their mouths dry. They blamed the cold, or bad luck, or the damp air creeping from the walls, never the dust. To admit that the comfort of their own beds was the source of their pain was unthinkable. Beds were symbols of decency, of safety, of home itself. In poorer quarters, the problem was even worse. Floors were bare, windows seldom opened, and walls lined with soot. Dust collected in corners like memories, undisturbed for years. Children slept in the same beds as their parents, their small lungs filling with what the day had left behind. A constant cough became a mark of the working-class proof of endurance rather than illness. The sound echoed through narrow streets, blending with the creak of wagons and the hiss of steam. It was the sound of a city breathing in its own decay. The wealthy were not exempt. Their fine fabrics, velvet drapes, silk sheets, wool blankets caught and held dust far more effectively than the coarse rags of the poor. Each time a servant shook a curtain, a cloud rose into the air and drifted down again. Feather pillows puffed out tiny storms that settled quietly over sleeping faces. The sweet smell of perfume and polish mixed with the taste of coal and sweat. They called it refinement, though every breath carried the same grey poison as the streets outside. Doctors began to suspect that dust played a role in sickness, particularly in the mysterious disease called consumption. But the idea was dismissed as foolishness. How could something so ordinary, so invisible, cause death illness? They insisted came from bad blood or moral weakness, not from the air inside one's home. And so the dust gathered undisturbed, growing thicker each day, layer upon layer, like the slow snowfall of forgotten years. Servants learned to live with it. They swept floors daily, but they could never reach what lay above the blankets, the bed frames, the beams, their arms tired, their lungs burned, and still the dust returned before morning. It fell from the ceiling, from clothing, from the very breath of those who slept. To clean was not to conquer, but to delay. And so, each evening, the beds were made as always, their surfaces smoothed and silent. The sleepers climbed in, unaware that they were lying within the residue of their own existence. By morning, the sunlight revealed what the night had hidden. In the first beams that slipped through the curtains, thousands of motes drifted lazily in the air, each one a fragment of the people who lived there. They sparkled like gold, beautiful in the light, harmless to the eye. Children watched them dance, reaching up to catch them. No one told them that those tiny glimmers were what filled their lungs each night. The line between wonder and decay was paper thin. In those homes, the act of sleep was inseparable from the act of breathing in the past. Every exhalation became tomorrow's dust, every dream a soft collapse into the air itself. It is chilling to think how gently the Victorians inhaled their own slow undoing, one breath at a time. And as the dust thickened upon the beds and lingered in the air, something deeper began to grow within it, an unseen presence that carried sickness from one breath to another. They slept beneath blankets of dust, mistaking its stillness for peace. Each cough in the dark stirred the remnants of their own lives into the air again. When that invisible haze began to carry more than memories, the quiet homes of the sleeping turned into slow chambers of disease. The heavy bed curtains of the Victorian era were meant to protect the sleeper from the cold, but what they truly held was everything a person should have escaped. Draped thickly around the bed, they created small chambers of air warm, silent, and suffocating. The idea was noble enough to trap heat, to keep drafts away, to create privacy in a crowded room. Yet behind the folds of those dense fabrics, another world grew. The same breath that comforted the sleeper grew stale by midnight. Every sigh, every trace of sweat, every secret scent of the human body lingered, unable to leave. The warmth they prized was the warmth of their own decay. The curtains were often made of velvet, wool, or heavy brocade, chosen not for practicality but for beauty. Their weight gave a sense of luxury, of being enclosed within one's own sanctuary. But the fabric absorbed everything: the smell of hair oil, the smoke from candles, the faint sourness of skin after long nights under too many blankets. Once drawn closed, they sealed the bed from the world outside and from fresh air alike. By morning, the air inside was thick enough to taste. It is bitterly funny that a society obsessed with purity invented the perfect tool for trapping its own filth. Washing such curtains was out of the question. The fabric was too heavy, the process too costly, and the need too invisible. Instead, they were brushed lightly with cloths, sprayed with perfume, or beaten on occasion to shake away visible dust. The smell never truly left, it only changed character. At first it was warm and musky, later sweet and rancid. Over the years, it became something that had no name, a mixture of body, fabric, and time. To those who lived within it, the scent meant comfort. To outsiders, it was almost unbearable. In winter, the curtain seemed a blessing. Families huddled under their thick folds, believing that warmth meant health. Children slept closer together, their breathing shallow in the enclosed space. The damp air pressed against the walls of the bed like another layer of skin. When someone coughed, the sound was muffled, caught in the folds of the cloth, where it seemed to linger long after. Doctors sometimes advised leaving the curtains open for ventilation, but few obeyed. The cold outside was too real, while the sickness inside was still invisible. If one imagined it today, it would be like sleeping inside a closet lined with wet coats and calling it comfort. The absurdity was invisible to those who knew no alternative. Servants bore the burden of care for these curtains. They shook them out in the mornings, sending dust and tiny flakes of soot flying through the air, then drew them closed again at night. The air that escaped during cleaning carried a faint smell of vinegar, oil, and skin proof that life itself clung to the fabric. When candles burned too close, the edges browned, giving off a sharp scent of scorched cloth. But even that smell blended into the room until no one noticed. The line between clean and foul was as blurred as the edge of shadow on velvet. The wealthy, ever proud of their bedrooms, decorated their bed curtains with tassels and embroidery. To them, the bed was not only a place of rest but a statement of taste and virtue. A well-draped bed symbolized order, modesty, and control. Yet beneath the elegance lay still air that soured each night. Guests who slept in such rooms often woke dizzy, their throats dry from breathing their own carbon and perfume. They left polite compliments on the warmth of their host's hospitality, never speaking of the nausea that followed. The poor envied such curtains but found their own substitutes old sheets, coarse blankets, or pieces of sackcloth hung loosely from strings. These makeshift enclosures trapped less heat but just as much damp. The smell of smoke and sweat mixed with that of the material itself, creating an odour that clung to everything within. In shared lodgings, when several people slept side by side, the air inside those improvised curtains became heavy with shared breath. The body's exhale turned into the body's inhale, an endless cycle of quiet suffocation. Inside these small cocoons, time behaved differently. The darkness was thicker, the silence deeper. Light from the fire outside could not penetrate. So nights stretched endlessly. Dreams took on the same heaviness as the air, the same dull weight. People woke feeling unrested, though they had not stirred for hours. They rubbed their eyes, unaware that what clouded their heads was not sleep but stagnation. The curtain's warmth was deceptive, its comfort poisonous. Over years, these curtains grew old, the edges frayed, the seams yellowed with oil and dust. Moths laid eggs between the folds, feeding on fibres soaked with sweat. When they moved, they released faint bursts of powder, the dry remains of wings long dead. Yet few replaced them. The curtains, after all, were part of the household, as constant as the bed itself. To remove them felt like erasing memory, so they stayed, witnesses to every night spent beneath their shadow. By the century's end, reformers began to speak of fresh air and ventilated rooms. They mocked the heavy curtains of earlier generations, calling them tombs of sleep. Yet even as the idea of health began to change, many refused to let go. Warmth still felt safer than air, and so the curtains remained, swaying gently in the stale breeze of habits too old to die. Those thick curtains were less a shield from cold than a trap for everything that made the body human. The breath that gave life turned against its giver. Souring in the folds of fabric meant to comfort. It is quietly horrifying to think of people sleeping soundly inside the scent of their own slow decay. And as those heavy curtains trapped both warmth and death, something unseen began to grow behind them in an invisible fog that carried sickness deeper into every breath of the sleeping. They believed warmth could preserve life, yet it was warmth that turned their beds into silent hothouses of disease. Every sigh and whisper lingered longer than it should, feeding what could not be seen. When the scent of those sealed nights began to cling to the living as it once did the dead, the illusion of safety finally started to unravel. In most Victorian homes, the idea of cleanliness was not measured by washing but by rearranging what could be seen. When the sheets grew too stained or too dark, they were not replaced. Instead, they were turned. The underside became the top, the illusion of freshness achieved with a single motion. This quiet ritual took only moments lift, pull, smooth, and pretend. The fabric that had pressed against bodies for weeks suddenly faced the open air, and the lie of cleanliness was complete. Beneath it, the truth remained, a map of sweat, dust, and blood that told the story of every night before. The bed was the most intimate thing in a house, yet also the least renewed. Washing sheets required boiling water, soap, and labour, things few families could spare. Servants, already worn thin from endless chores, saved time where they could. Turning the sheet was a gesture of care that cost nothing. Housewives called it making do. The poor called it practical. Even the wealthy, with their large homes and heavy linens, preferred the illusion of effort to the inconvenience of truth. It is almost amusing that a society famed for manners thought nothing of sleeping on yesterday's dirt, so long as it was neatly arranged. The sheets themselves bore witness to everything: sweat from restless nights, oil from hair, the faint stickiness of spilled broth or medicine. Flea bites bled small dots that dried into brown constellations along the fabric. Sometimes the shapes of bodies were visible even when the bed was empty. Dark outlines where weight had pressed into the cloth. The marks were as personal as fingerprints, and when the sheet was turned, those ghosts of use were buried just beneath the surface, still warm, still alive. 2 months was not unusual between washings. In winter, it could be longer. Water was icy, soap expensive, and drying indoors filled the air with damp. Washing was not a weekly rhythm but a rare event, reserved for special occasions or visible necessity. Families layered blankets on top to hide the discoloration, believing that what could not be seen could not harm them. They misted the sheets with perfume, dusted them with powder, or left sprigs of herbs beneath pillows. Nothing truly changed. The smell of sweat and iron and mildew lingered, faint but inescapable. When sickness came, the bed became its own small ecosystem. Fevers soaked the fabric until it clung to the skin like another layer. When the worst had passed, the sheet was simply flipped. The clean side faced up. The stains of illness disappeared from view. Yet the warmth of the body had already seeped deep into the fibres. Even in death, the routine continued. A new occupant took the place of the old, and the same sheet carried on its quiet duty. No one questioned it. The bed was eternal. The body was not. Servants knew the truth most intimately. They were the ones who handled the linens, felt the damp patches, and smelled the mix of sweat and perfume. Their hands rubbed against bloodstains that no scrubbing could remove. They learned which families pretended at cleanliness and which did not bother at all, but their voices carried no weight. Their task was to serve, not to see. So they turned the sheets, folded the corners, and hid the evidence. What mattered was that the bed looked untouched by morning. In the grand houses, the same deception took on an air of refinement. Cleanliness was declared, not performed. Fresh linens were promised to guests, though few were truly fresh. The sheets were ironed smooth and scented with lavender. But beneath the polish lay weeks of use. Guests noticed the faint sourness, the way the fabric felt slightly greasy against the skin. Yet politeness kept them silent. Appearances were sacred, and no one dared disturb them. If one compared it to today, it would be like flipping a stained shirt inside out and calling it new. Ridiculous, perhaps, but deeply human. The act of turning rather than washing carried something almost ritualistic. It was both denial and defiance, an insistence that life could go on without confronting its mess. Families who could not control poverty, sickness, or decay could at least control the appearance of order. A turned sheet was proof that they still cared, that they still belonged to a world of civility. Beneath that gesture lay the quiet resignation of those who knew they could not afford purity. Over time, the fabric absorbed more than stains. It took on the scent of the home itself, the smoke from the hearth, the breath of sleepers, the faint rot of damp walls. When lifted, it released the memory of every season it had endured. The texture changed, growing stiff, rough, then soft again where bodies had worn it thin. Holes appeared and were patched. Tears were sewn with mismatched thread. The same sheets could serve for years, until they no longer resembled what they once were. Yet even then, they were kept. Cloth, like habit, was too precious to discard. Doctors warned of foul bedding and household miasmas, urging families to wash more often, but their words rarely reached the poor, and when they did, they sounded like mockery. How could one boil linens when firewood was scarce, when every drop of water had to be carried by hand? Cleanliness, they said, was the virtue of the idle. Those who worked, slept, and woke to work again could not afford such luxuries. So the same sheets turned again and again, holding the history of their owners until the threadbare fabric finally tore beyond repair. When sunlight fell across those beds in the morning, it illuminated more than dust. It revealed the quiet compromise that defined Victorian life, the choice to live among decay and call it endurance. The sheets glowed pale in the light, almost beautiful from afar, and no one cared to look closer. Beauty, after all, was only the distance between the eye and the truth. The turned sheets were symbols of a deeper denial, where cleanliness was not an act but a disguise. The gesture of care hid what care refused to touch, preserving comfort through forgetfulness. It is unsettling to imagine how easily people could sleep upon the proof of their own neglect and call it decency. And as the fabric grew darker beneath each turn, the boundary between the living and the filth that surrounded them became impossible to tell apart. Each sheet was turned like a page in a diary, one side concealing what the other had already confessed. The illusion of order lingered above the quiet rot of daily life. As the false calm of those rooms began to peel away, even the air seemed to whisper what the fabric had tried so hard to hide. For the poor, warmth was never a given thing. It had to be borrowed, stolen, or shared with something still breathing. Beds stood close to stoves or next to the wooden pens where pigs or goats slept. The crackle of coals and the faint rustle of straw replaced the silence of proper rooms. In winter, the air was thick with the smell of smoke and animal breath, a warmth that clung not from comfort but from survival. Sleep came only when the body stopped caring about what it touched. The walls, if there were any, were stained with soot. The floor was damp with traces of life and waste. And in that mingling of heat and stench, families found their rest. A bed in the kitchen meant proximity to food, fire, and filth all at once. The faint sweetness of spilled broth mixed with the acrid tang of burned fat, soaking into the cloth that covered the straw mattresses. Children slept closest to the stove, their faces smudged with ash by morning. Parents lay beside them, half listening to the embers sigh in the dark. Some even placed their beds directly under the chimney, believing the rising smoke kept away disease. The illusion of safety was worth the constant film of soot that settled over their skin. It is strangely poetic that the poor found comfort in what the rich called contamination. Near the livestock pens, sleep had its own rhythm. The grunting of pigs, the shifting of hooves, the quiet breath of animals filled the night. Those sounds were the lullabies of the desperate. Warmth drifted from the bodies of the beasts, thick and sour. The straw that cushioned their sleep was shared too, crawling with unseen life. Fleas and lice passed freely from creature to human, feeding on whoever slept deepest. Yet this arrangement persisted not out of ignorance but necessity. Firewood was costly, and rooms were few. To share heat was to survive another winter. The smell of these rooms never left. Even freshly washed clothes could not escape it. The scent of manure and charred wood followed people into the streets, marking their poverty before they spoke. Visitors noticed it but said nothing. There was no shame in being poor, only in pretending not to be. So the poor embraced what they could not change. They aired their bedding in the yard, beating the straw to chase out insects, only for the wind to carry more dust back in. The circle of effort and defeat became part of life's rhythm. In many cottages, animals were treated less as beasts and more as reluctant housemates. Goats slept in corners, dogs near the hearth, Hens roosted on rafters above the beds. At night, all the warmth in the house came from breath, not bricks. The line between human and animal blurred under the same blanket of smoke and straw. Babies reached out in sleep and brushed against fur. Sometimes they woke to find the blanket damp where a creature had lain. Yet the presence of life, even filthy and loud, was preferable to the terror of freezing alone. Illness spread easily in these spaces. The same air that kept the family alive carried sickness through every breath. Coughs echoed in the narrow rooms, absorbed by the straw, released again with the morning warmth. Doctors rarely visited such homes, and if they did, they blamed the stench before the poverty. But no amount of advice could change the reality that hunger and cold were worse enemies than filth. To the poor, dirt was a companion, not a threat. Compared to the quiet sterility of modern bedrooms, these scenes feel both horrifying and heartbreakingly human. Servants in the houses of the wealthy sometimes slept in similar conditions, though no one admitted it. Their quarters were near kitchens, basements, or stables, where warmth seeped upward through cracks in the floor. They shared the same smells, the same crawling pests, but with none of the ownership of their surroundings. Their sleep belonged to someone else, the master's clock, the master's house, the master's rules. In that way, even comfort became a form of servitude. Over time, the line between survival and habit vanished. People who had grown used to the scent of smoke and dung found pure air strange and unfriendly. Travellers who spent a night in cleaner lodgings often complained they could not rest. The quiet unnerved them. The lack of warmth felt cruel. The human body, so easily disgusted by decay, can also learn to need it. To them, the smell of the stable was the smell of life itself. By morning, beds near the stove were coated in a fine grey dust. Straw near the livestock was damp and sweet, sticky from the night's warmth. The people who rose from these beds did not think of filth. They thought of another day survived. They brushed the ash from their hair, splashed a little cold water on their faces, and began again. To them, cleanliness was for those who could afford idleness. Survival was its own virtue. Those who slept beside the warmth of animals or the breath of fire traded purity for endurance. The smell of their beds told the story of their struggle better than any words could. It is both tragic and admirable how people could find peace in the same air that carried their decay. And beneath that uneasy peace, something darker stirred, a slow transformation of body and air that would make even the strongest question what it meant to be truly clean. They shared warmth with beasts and called it mercy, not realizing the cost it demanded. The same fires and bodies that protected them began to change what it meant to survive. In time, even the air that had once saved them turned against them in ways no one could see. For women in the Victorian age, privacy was a rare luxury, and cleanliness was often a matter of belief rather than practice. In homes where water was precious and labour constant, even the most intimate parts of a woman's body were governed by restraint and silence. During menstruation, there were no proper cloths or sanitary means, only torn scraps of old fabric or handfuls of straw pressed between layers of clothing. At night, the same beds that held the day's exhaustion also held the quiet evidence of womanhood, staining through sheets already worn thin. There was no shame expressed aloud, yet the shame was everywhere, in the avoidance of eyes, in the unspoken rule that a stain should simply be left to dry. The idea was simple: what the sun could not see could not hurt. A woman would lie down at the end of the day knowing her body might betray her in the night. There was no choice, no fresh bedding, and no separate space for women during their cycle. The same sheets were shared with husbands, sisters, even children. In dim candlelight, the fabric's discoloration barely showed, blending into the tapestry of use that marked every home. The smell of iron hung faintly in the air, mingling with sweat, smoke, and the sourness of damp straw beneath the bed. It was a scent that spoke of endurance more than filth. Victorians often prided themselves on modesty, yet their modesty reeked of denial rather than virtue. To wash bedding during this time was considered both wasteful and unnecessary. Firewood for boiling water was reserved for cooking, and soap was too costly to use on sheets that would only be soiled again. So the stains accumulated, dark at first, then brown, then pale as they aged, fading like old memories but never disappearing. Women called it natural, a harmless trace of life's rhythm. Doctors, mostly men, rarely spoke of it except to label menstruation as a weakness, a sickness of the female temperament. And yet, in their ignorance, they created a culture where women bled in silence and slept in it too. The belief that menstrual blood should dry naturally was not just superstition, it was survival logic. In a world where labouring hands could not rest, waiting for a cloth to dry or for linens to be washed meant losing hours of work. The idea of purity was secondary to practicality. Women tucked rags or hay into their skirts, sometimes even sewing small pouches of fabric to catch the flow. These makeshift methods worked poorly. By morning, the cloths were heavy and damp, and the bed bore new marks to join the old. Yet this was ordinary, even unremarkable. There was no disgust in it, only exhaustion. A mother would teach her daughter how to fold the fabric tightly, how to move carefully so as not to leave new stains. It was a quiet education, passed down between whispers and gestures. The daughters learned early that their bodies required secrecy. Any mention of discomfort was seen as improper, a breach of the silence that guarded domestic respectability. So they carried their pain quietly, turning their pillows and pretending sleep came easily. The fabric beneath them hardened with time, stiff from the salt of dried blood, softened again with new stains layered over old ones. The beds became archives of a bodily truth no one would speak aloud. For the poor, these realities were even harsher. They slept on straw pallets or rough cloth spread over wooden boards. The straw absorbed the blood, growing damp and musty, never truly drying in cold months. Women replaced it only when it rotted or smelled too strongly. In wealthier homes, where linens were finer, the problem was hidden behind lace and perfume. Sheets might be scented with rose oil or lavender water to disguise what could not be erased, but the scent of decay always lingered beneath. If one were to compare it to today, it would be like masking rot with flowers. Pretty, perhaps, but never clean. Husbands pretended not to notice. They turned away in bed, their silence an act of both denial and entitlement. To speak of such matters was indecent. Some believed that touching a menstruating woman was dangerous, that her body carried a kind of temporary curse. This superstition, though unspoken, permitted men to look away. So the women endured their nights in stillness, careful not to move too much, to stain too visibly. Morning came, and the bed-sheets were folded neatly again, the proof hidden under order. Servants, when tasked with washing, handled these linens with quiet disgust. They boiled the fabric in large iron pots when they could, but often the stains never fully disappeared. Soap could not wash away what time had already set. The sight of it was common, the smell ordinary. Yet behind that ordinariness lay a deeper truth women were conditioned to accept decay as part of living. The slow rotting of fabric mirrored the slow wearing away of dignity. In winter, when washing was nearly impossible, the smell grew thick. The mingled odours of blood, sweat, and damp fabric turned the bedroom into a chamber of slow suffocation. Some women sprinkled starch or chalk powder on the stains, turning them pale, as though pretending they were gone. Others simply flipped the sheet, believing that the unseen side did not count. The act was one of quiet rebellion, an insistence that one could still live with what society refused to see. Over years, the bed became both witness and accomplice. It held within it the private rhythms of a woman's life, her cycles, her pregnancies, her sickness, her grief. The fabric, once white, turned the colour of ash. To anyone else, It looked like neglect. To her, it was survival. There was no shame left, only endurance. It's strange how easily people mistake endurance for strength, when it's often just the absence of choice. Even when awareness of hygiene began to rise near the end of the century, the practice persisted among the poor. Old beliefs died slowly, buried under generations of habit and fatigue. Doctors began to speak of bacteria, of infection, of unseen dangers, but these words meant little to those who still hauled water by hand. The body, the bed, and the stain were all part of the same weary existence, quiet, unclean, and entirely human. The unwashed sheets of menstruation told a story that no one dared to voice, a story of labour, silence, and the quiet strength of those who could not rest. The act of letting stains dry was not filth, but a reluctant form of dignity, a refusal to let poverty strip away one more ounce of control. Something is haunting in how the most natural part of being a woman became the most hidden. And beneath those layers of silence, something darker grew, a sickness born not from blood itself, but from the way the world chose to ignore it. Every bed carried traces of women's lives, written in stains no one dared to name. Their silence kept the illusion of cleanliness alive, even as infection spread quietly beneath the sheets. What began as modesty would soon turn into something far more dangerous than dirt. Mourning in the Victorian city began not with washing but with movement. The sound of carts, bells, and footsteps filled the narrow streets before the sun had fully risen. Inside every home, men and women woke beneath layers of damp air, their bodies coated in the residue of the night. The walls still held the warmth of shared breath, the faint tang of sweat clinging to the sheets and skin alike. There were no rituals of refreshment, no rush to cleanse. People simply stood up, dressed, and stepped into the day as they were. The dirt of sleep became part of their clothing, absorbed by collars, sleeves, and coats that had seen more nights than washings. To wash in the morning was seen as unnecessary, even harmful. Many believed that cold water on the skin, especially on the face, could invite illness or fever. Water itself was suspect, drawn from pumps that sometimes ran brown, stored in buckets that reeked of iron and rot. So the basin in the corner remained unused, the towel stiff and grey from long neglect. A splash of rosewater or vinegar might serve in place of washing for those who could afford it, though this did little more than mask the odour. The poor had even less. They wiped their faces with the same cloths used to dust furniture or dry dishes. Cleanliness was an idea best left to the wealthy, and even they often misunderstood it. The morning streets of London were a procession of the unwashed. The air was heavy, thick with coal smoke and the scent of bodies that had not seen water in days. A man in a wool coat carried yesterday's sweat beneath today's effort. A woman in layered skirts walked briskly, her perfume unable to fight the sour undertone that followed her. The city smelled human in the truest sense, dense, warm, and alive with decay. If one were to step through those streets now, it would feel like walking through a cloud of fermented life. Workers hurried to factories, clerks to offices, children to schools, all without the interruption of soap or water. Their hair, still oily from the night, shone under the grey morning light. Hats absorbed the sweat of the brow, collars softened with grime. The breath of hundreds mingled in the fog, turning the city's damp chill into something almost tangible. It was a shared odour, a communal truth, and no one questioned it. To smell of work, of sleep, of life, that was normal. Cleanliness, after all, was for Sundays. In households across every class, this neglect was ritual. Servants rose before dawn to dress their masters, but not to wash them. Towels were decorative, meant to suggest hygiene rather than practice it. The first act of the day was not cleansing but clothing. Appearance mattered more than purity. A splash of cologne or dab of powder stood in for the effort of water. And when those powders mixed with sweat, They created a sweetness that was both pleasant and putrid, a signature scent of the age. It is darkly amusing how people once believed they could perfume their way out of filth. Doctors occasionally wrote about morning miasmas, warning that unwashed bodies could make entire neighbourhoods ill, yet most ignored such warnings. Soap cost money, time was scarce, and convenience triumphed over caution. The same hands that handled coal, horses, and waste would later touch bread and lace without pause. In the morning markets, vendors wiped their noses on their sleeves, then counted coins with the same fingers. No one flinched. Dirt was universal, and strangely democratic. Children learned early to endure the smell of others as naturally as the sound of bells or carriages. Their uniforms stiffened with grime, their shoes crusted with yesterday's mud. They sat in classrooms filled with the odour of sweat and soot, the air thick enough to taste. Teachers did not comment. They smelled the same. There was no concept of personal scent, only collective existence. The human smell of the city was as much a part of its identity as its bridges or towers. The wealthy, of course, liked to believe themselves above such habits. But even in grand townhouses, the difference was one of fragrance, not hygiene. Lavender sachets hung beside unwashed linens. Velvet drapes trapped smoke, powder, and perfume until the air grew stale. Guests arrived, powdered and painted, their skin gleaming not from cleanliness but from grease mixed with scent. The illusion of refinement was built upon layers of residue. A lady might carry the smell of violets, yet beneath it lingered the musk of human heat. By midday, the city itself had changed character. The combination of warmth, labour, and filth produced an atmosphere unlike any other. The sun coaxed odours from brick, horse, and body alike. The smell of the night's sweat matured in the daylight, ripening into something both nauseating and strangely familiar. London did not just smell bad, it smelled alive. To the people within it, this was the scent of existence, the rhythm of daily life continuing without pause. In a world obsessed with progress, even the stench of neglect became a kind of proof that life went on. The absence of morning hygiene revealed more than dirt. It revealed indifference. When survival meant labour, cleanliness became a luxury. Those who smelled too clean were often ridiculed for idleness or vanity. Sweat was the badge of the working class, perfume the armour of the rich, and water the forgotten link between them. Each day began where the last had ended, with no separation between the night's decay and the day's labour. To be unwashed was not shameful, it was simply practical. Yet beneath this practicality was danger. Skin infections, lice, and sores spread easily in the absence of basic hygiene. The damp air of unwashed rooms became a breeding ground for disease. Still, the people endured, moving through the fog of their own creation, unaware of how it shaped them. The line between body and city blurred until both exhaled the same weary breath. Those who stepped into the day without washing carried more than dirt. They carried the scent of a world that refused to pause. The morning air of London was a living mixture of ambition and decay, inseparable from the people who filled it. It is both revolting and remarkable that an entire city could march forward while wrapped in the odour of its own sleep, and somewhere between the rising fog and the fading night, something unseen began to grow. A sickness fed not by dirt alone, but by the belief that dirt was harmless. Every morning carried the residue of the night before, turning the city itself into a living extension of its people. Their breath, their sweat, their stillness, all lingered in the air they shared. What began as ordinary neglect would soon reveal how easily routine can become a slow form of decay. Death in a Victorian home did not always arrive with ceremony. Often it came quietly, in the same bed where the person had eaten, sweated, and slept through countless nights. The bed became both cradle and coffin, a place where life faded into stillness under layers of used blankets. When someone died, their body remained there for days, sometimes longer, while the family gathered, prayed, or waited for the undertaker. The air thickened with a still warmth, the scent of illness deepening into something heavier. Yet no one thought to move the body elsewhere. The bed had become part of the process, part of the house itself, a fixture of both life and death. After the funeral, there was no ritual of cleansing. Sheets might be changed, perhaps, but the mattress stayed. It was too costly, too heavy, and too ordinary to be treated as anything sacred. The same straw-stuffed bedding that had held a fevered body would soon hold another sleeper. The idea of washing or replacing it seemed absurd. Life moved on, and practicality always triumphed over sentiment. Those who inherited the bed rarely questioned its history. It was enough to know it had once belonged to someone dear. The smell that lingered, part sickness, part time, was simply accepted as the odour of the home itself. The dead left traces that water could never erase. Even after burial, the bed retained them, the faint impression of weight, the discoloration on the fabric, the softness in the spot where the body had lain longest. The smell of decay mingled with the familiar scent of soap, candle wax, or damp air. Some families said the bed remembered its occupant, though few meant it literally. Still, the thought was hard to escape. Each night, as someone new lay down, the quiet ghost of warmth beneath the sheets seemed to echo what had once been there. Victorians prided themselves on restraint, but few things reveal their fear of the body more clearly than their comfort with sleeping on its remains. Death was not rare enough to provoke horror. Illness came and went like the seasons. The poor often shared their beds with the dying because there was no other choice. The wealthy, though surrounded by space, still preferred to keep death close. It was considered proper for a family member to die at home, surrounded by familiar walls and furniture. To die in one's own bed was seen as fortunate. That same bed, days later, would be remade and used again, as though nothing had changed. No one imagined that death might linger there, invisible and patient. The concept of sanitation was still primitive. Germ theory was not yet trusted, and most households saw no reason to fear the residue of the dead. The sheets could be aired out, perhaps beaten in the yard, but the mattress, dense, expensive, and stitched tight, remained untouched. It absorbed everything's sweat, sickness, and the slow breakdown of the body's last warmth. Over time, the straw within grew darker, dampened by moisture and oil. When pressed, it released a faint, sour odour. But to the Victorians, this was simply the smell of age. If one were to lift the cover of such a bed today, it would be like opening a time capsule sealed with both memory and rot. In poorer homes, where death came often and beds were few, the cycle was cruelly efficient. The same mattress might cradle multiple generations, each one leaving behind its trace of life and death. Mothers died in childbirth upon it, and their children later slept in the same spot. Men who perished from fever or injury left no legacy but the scent they added to the cloth. It was a quiet inheritance, absorbed rather than spoken of. Poverty made sentiment impossible. There was no space for ritual, no room for cleanliness. The dead became part of the furniture, their presence compressed beneath new layers of dust and time. Even among the wealthy, superstition often guided practice more than hygiene. Some believed that washing the mattress would disturb the spirit of the deceased, that water might invite it back into the home. Others simply ignored the idea of contamination. Sickness was God's will, not something that could be scrubbed away. In this way, faith and ignorance worked together to preserve the invisible remnants of death in every household. The bed, once a site of rest, became a quiet monument to the belief that what cannot be seen cannot harm. The smell of death was not sharp or sudden. It was subtle, lingering like smoke after a candle has been snuffed. Servants learned to recognize it, though they rarely spoke of it aloud. When new occupants lay down, They might feel a faint chill or sense a heaviness in the mattress beneath them. It was psychological, perhaps, or something more. But to sleep in a bed that had once held the dying was an ordinary act, not a morbid one. The living grew used to sharing space with the dead. The closeness of death was both a fear and a comfort. Over time, the line between reverence and indifference blurred. To wash away all signs of the dead felt disrespectful, yet to leave them entirely was unsanitary. Victorians existed in that uneasy middle, where decay and decorum coexisted quietly. A bed was never truly clean, never truly empty. Each person who slept upon it added to the unseen weight of the past. Every sigh, every illness, every death settled into the fibres, until the mattress itself became a kind of record. It is unsettling how easily a society that feared ghosts could sleep atop their lingering traces. Doctors eventually began to notice patterns. Families struck repeatedly by fever, illness spreading through homes where the dead had lain. They urged cleaning, fumigation, and fresh bedding, but their advice reached only those who could afford to care. For most, the notion of replacing a mattress was unthinkable. Beds were heirlooms, symbols of continuity, a stain, a smell, even a shadow on the sheet. These were not warnings but memories. To remove them was to erase history. So people slept on, surrounded by ghosts that did not need to walk to be felt. The bed of the dead became the bed of the living, and the cycle of rest and rot continued without pause. The same fabric that held the last breath of one life welcomed the first of another. There is a strange tenderness in that continuity, though it hides a quiet horror beneath its surface. And as night after night passed, those who slept began to dream of warmth that did not belong to them, as though the bed itself remembered too well. Each bed in those homes was a keeper of the dead, holding what families refused to let go. Their refusal to wash or replace spoke less of thrift than of denial. In the dim air of those rooms, memory and decay began to blur into one haunting presence that never truly left. The curtains that surrounded Victorian beds were more than decoration. They were barriers between sleep and the rest of the world, meant to keep in warmth and privacy. Heavy fabrics hung thick around the bed frame, trapping air, breath, and every odour that passed through the night. Over time, they became archives of the people who had lived and slept within their folds. The scent of sweat, smoke, perfume, and sickness all blended into one quiet, stale fragrance that no one noticed anymore. The fabric darkened slowly, absorbing not just dust but years. And though the curtains brushed against faces and hands each night, no one thought to wash them. To clean a bed curtain seemed unnecessary, even excessive. Water and soap were reserved for clothing, not furniture. The idea that fabric could hold illness was unfamiliar. People believed that what hung above or around them was harmless, as if air itself would purify what it touched. So the curtains remained, thick and unmoving, closing in the heat during winter and suffocating in summer. In the dim candlelight, their folds seemed comforting, a shelter from the world's noise and draughts. Yet inside that comfort, the air was heavy with the residue of life, moisture from breath, the sour trace of unwashed skin, the faint musk of oil lamps burning too close. Victorian people slept beneath velvet and dust and called it luxury. Servants sometimes beat the curtains with wooden rods to shake out visible dust, but the effort was little more than theatre. The deeper filth stayed, clinging to fibres thick with grease and air soot. When light from the window slipped through, one could see the haze rise, a faint shimmering cloud that carried the smell of age. No one questioned it. To live surrounded by such things was normal. The curtain was not merely fabric, it was inheritance. In many homes, the same drapes hung for decades, passed down like jewellery or furniture. The colour faded, the edges frayed, but sentiment kept them in place. The wealthy preferred velvet, brocade, or damask, fabrics that trapped both air and memory. The poor used coarser cloth or patched together quilts, but the result was the same. Every movement in the bed stirred particles of the past. Children grew up breathing through the same curtains that had enclosed their parents and grandparents. The idea that such fabric could carry disease was foreign. Even when sickness spread through households, no one suspected the thick folds of cloth hanging inches from their faces. It was easier to blame the weather or bad fortune than to imagine that warmth itself could kill. The smell of these curtains was distinctive. It was not the foulness of rot, but the quiet odour of bodies layered over years. Sweat mixed with candle soot, hair oil, smoke, and perfume until the scent became familiar enough to seem natural. When guests entered, they might sense the closeness of the air, the faint metallic tang that clung to every surface. To the inhabitants, however, it was simply home. If someone today could step into one of those bedrooms, they would call it suffocating, but to the Victorians, that heaviness was comfort itself. Curtains were rarely touched by sunlight. Rooms were dim, windows often sealed to keep out bad air. The fabric hung thick and motionless, collecting whatever floated unseen. In winter, when fires burned constantly, smoke added another layer of residue. Even the finest homes smelled faintly of ash and human presence. When illness came, the curtains were drawn tighter, sealing in the warmth of fever and the breath of the dying. Once death had passed, the curtains stayed where they were, unwashed and unshaken, holding within them the last exhalations of the dead. No one thought to replace them. To wash them would be to erase history. In the poor quarters, where space was scarce, curtains often doubled as partitions between beds. Entire families lived and slept within one room, separated only by a hanging cloth. Privacy came at the cost of fresh air. The fabric turned damp with condensation, its folds soft with mould. The smell clung to hair and clothing, spreading beyond the bedroom into the street. Yet those curtains were treated with quiet pride. They symbolized modesty, the thin veil between decency and exposure. Poverty made them sacred, even as they grew black with grime. The irony of it all was striking. Victorians feared the open air but trusted the fabric that suffocated them. Curtains were meant to protect, yet they trapped every invisible danger. Even when new theories of disease began to circulate, when doctors whispered about bacteria and unseen contagion, the old habits persisted. Cleaning was a performance, not a prevention. To draw the curtains each night and close off the world was an act of safety, not superstition, in their eyes. The slow poisoning of air and fabric was simply the price of peace. Within those folds of cloth, intimacy and decay coexisted. Lovers whispered, children dreamed, and the sick coughed into the same trapped air. The curtains bore witness to it all. When shaken, they exhaled years of life in a single breath. Servants who cleaned them knew the texture of that dust. It was soft, greasy, and slightly sweet. It clung to their fingers even after washing. No one asked what it was made of. The truth would have been too personal. To sleep behind such curtains was to lie within the breath of generations. The fabric was not just decoration but evidence, proof that life had passed, settled, and remained. There is something quietly horrifying about comfort built on the weight of the past, and when those curtains finally stirred in the night, it was not always the wind that moved them. Every curtain told a story of lives lived too close and cleaned too little. They hung like silent witnesses to decades of breath and decay. Somewhere within their folds, the line between memory and infection began to blur. In the dim corners of Victorian homes, the bed was never truly empty. Beneath the worn boards and fraying cloth, small lives moved in the dark, rats, ferrets, and squirrels weaving their path through the dust. The poor could hear them at night, the faint scratching beneath their heads, the whisper of paws against the wood. It was not strange, not even frightening. It was simply part of life. The walls were thin, the nights long, and warmth, no matter its source, was something to be shared. The creatures came for the same reasons people gathered: heat, crumbs, shelter. Straw mattresses offered both softness and safety, their hollows perfect for nests. When the fire burned low and the house fell silent, these unseen guests took over. Droppings mixed with dust beneath the bed. The smell was constant but ignored. In homes where hunger was daily and exhaustion deeper than fear, no one wasted energy on disgust. The bed became a borderless space between the human and the animal, a small world that pulsed quietly beneath sleep. It was common to wake and find gnawed cloth or tiny paw prints pressed into the sheets. Some claimed to have felt the brush of a tail across their feet, or the small weight of something moving beneath the covers. Yet no one spoke of it with horror. These intrusions were expected, like the cold that seeped through the floor or the smoke that blackened the ceiling. In winter, rats were a kind of company. They were warm, persistent, and alive. And in a world where death came easily, even that counted for something. Victorian poverty left no room for disgust, only adaptation. Children grew up sharing space with these creatures, learning to distinguish between their sounds in the dark. The quick skitter of mice was familiar. The slower shuffle of a rat meant something larger. Mothers might sigh, lift the blanket, and shake off the droppings before tucking their children back in. Fathers trapped what they could, though it was often futile. For every rat caught, another waited. The line between home and wild blurred with every night's sleep. The poor lived inside nature, not apart from it, and the bed was simply another ecosystem. The richer households fared only slightly better. Grand houses kept cats, but even they could not stop the infestation entirely. The smell of decay attracted everything that crawled or fed in secret. Behind velvet curtains and under carved bed frames, mice still built their homes. Servants swept, scoured, and laid traps. But the problem returned with the cold. Luxury did not protect against filth, it only hid it better. The same rodents that gnawed at bread in the kitchens sometimes crept upward, drawn by crumbs and candle drippings. Even the polished world of comfort had its tiny intruders. Diseases spread silently through these nightly encounters. Fleas travelled from rat to blanket, from blanket to body. Infection was invisible, and its path untraceable. The poor did not fear what they could not see. The wealthy pretended it did not exist. Both lived with the same quiet threat. If one were to pull back the covers of a Victorian bed today, it would look less like a resting place and more like a living museum of dust, fur, and history. There was something almost poetic in that coexistence. Humans sought warmth, animals sought shelter, and together they created a fragile peace. The scratching beneath the bed became a lullaby of survival. Some families left scraps intentionally near the corners, believing it kept the creatures from climbing higher. Others prayed each night that they would not hear the soft gnawing too close to their heads. Sleep was always a negotiation, a truce between hunger, cold, and the world beyond the blanket. In the poorest rooms, where 10 or more shared a single bed, the animals were often unseen but never absent. They were part of the air, part of the noise, part of the texture of life itself. Even when a rat scurried across a sleeping face or left a trail of filth behind. People did not scream. They brushed it away and turned over. Fatigue overcame fear. Disgust dulled with repetition. Survival left no time for purity. The bed, once imagined as sanctuary, had become a microcosm of Victorian life, crowded, dirty, alive. The stories told by reformers and writers of the age often exaggerated, but not by much. London's slums teemed with vermin. Country cottages harboured nests under damp straw. Hospitals, orphanages, and even boarding schools faced the same problem. No bed was untouched. The creatures thrived on human neglect, feeding on crumbs, warmth, and indifference. And yet, to those who lived then, this was normal. It was not horror, it was habit. The boundary between human and animal had thinned to nothing. To sleep in such a bed was to share breath with the smallest of lives, to dream beside hunger and decay without protest. The world of the Victorians did not end when the lamps went out. It only shifted shape, becoming quieter, smaller, and more intimate. It is strange to think that even in deathly silence, their nights were never truly theirs, and when morning came, the house stirred with both human and beast, each rising to face the same day once more. The Victorian bed was never just a place to sleep. It was a living world, a slow symphony of warmth, breath, and infestation. Every night, families lay down amid the whispers of a life too crowded to be clean. And now, as the story of their restless sleep fades into quiet, may your own rest come easier than theirs ever did. Good night, sleep well, and be grateful your bed does not breathe back at you.